1 minute.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is time now for another edition of the most disruptive show covering news, events, politics, and more from all sides of many different political aisles, as well as across the surface of this country and our globe. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, a burning ember in the darkness, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Hope everybody is having a good morning. Let's get into the headlines. First up, in COVID news, at least 2,471 new coronavirus deaths and 70,142 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. More deaths than we've seen in a little while and more cases than we've seen this week, but they're still down from the numbers we saw last week. Over the past week, there has been an average of 77,661 cases per day, a decrease of 43% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 27,873,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 490,000 have died from it. We are less than a week away, I would say, at this point, from passing the 500,000 death mark, which is a pretty big number of people to have died from a single disease in such a short period of time. Put it like that, in this country alone. Moving on, life expectancy in the U.S. fell by a full year in the first half of 2020. That's a change that experts say was fueled by the growing coronavirus pandemic. And according to the CDC, the life expectancy for the entire population dropped to 77.8 years. Black men suffered the largest decline, with life expectancy dropping by 3 years between January and June 2020. And Hispanic men saw a fall in life expectancy of 2.4 years during that same period. And I'll put it like this. If COVID did a bunch of this, some of these trends were already trending that way. We've had a drop in overall life expectancy in the U.S. for a couple of years. This is after basically a continuous rise in the life expectancy for decade after decade after decade after decade. So there are deeper problems, deeper stuff going on, whether you're looking at our healthcare system or diet or a new coronavirus spreading. It's not good to see. Any quick comments on this, Jamarl?
Well, look, it's an indictment of, almost like an experiential indictment of your society. If your society lifespan is going down, there's no reason for it to go down. That number should only go up, especially with the advances in medical science, improvements in standard of living and all of that stuff. I honestly put this, believe it or not, further into economics than I do anywhere else. Because look, regardless of what happened, 42% of the public was only making $18,000 a year before COVID. That was before COVID. Do you believe that number is somehow better? And with a number at like 18,000, what kind of life do you think those individuals have in this society, making that paltry amount? Many of those people have kids. Many of those people are head of household. So this number was going this way. The number of suicides, the number of drug abuse, all of those things are driven to some degree by economic realities of the things of our world. So yeah, like you said, this number was trending that way anyway. If you have 70%, 60-70% of your population on a hamster wheel constantly, where if anything happens, if they get sick, if they miss a paycheck, they're screwed. That level of stress in and of itself can break a person. And we're talking about how many people in this country, what, 42% at the very least? And that 42% number is low. That is us lowballing what we consider to be poverty. That number could be 30,000 and still could be considered poverty in honest terms. So yeah, this is, an indictment of our society. And by the way, this isn't necessarily happening in the UK. Why? Why isn't this happening in Canada? Why? Because those places have healthcare systems. Those places have integrated healthcare systems. Whether you're dirt poor, you can be making $18,000 a year and still get the healthcare of somebody who is an oligarch. That's the difference. And so, yeah.
Well, as far as I know, they also don't have long-term wage stagnation, unlike the U.S., which for like 50 years straight at this point has had wage stagnation across most sectors, and cost of living keeps going up, the cost of buying a house keeps going up, all that stuff. But if you're not making more money, if you're making proportionately a lot less money than you used to, then that will lead to what you were talking about.
They keep pushing neoliberal policies. If you were going 50 years ago, how much would you have to pay for school, for college? How much do you have to pay now? Like, I'm making the point that those things are being offshored onto individuals while their wages aren't going anywhere. So, yeah, Shane, 1,000% agree with you.
100%. All right. Going back into the news here, in vaccine news, yesterday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sharply criticized the wildly uneven and unfair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, saying that 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccinations and demanding a global effort to get all people in every nation vaccinated as soon as possible. The UN chief told a high-level meeting of the UN Security Council that 130 countries had not received a single dose of vaccine and declared that at this critical moment, quote, end quote, vaccine equity is the biggest moral test before the global community. The Secretary General called on the world's major economic powers in the Group of 20 to establish an emergency task force to establish a plan and coordinate its implementation and financing. He said the task force should have the capacity to, quote, mobilize the pharmaceutical companies and key industry and logistics actors, end quote. Applications for asylum in the European Union dropped by more than 30% in 2020 compared to the previous year, reaching their lowest level since 2013, before the refugee crisis began in full force from the Middle East, ISIS, the Syrian war, all that. The European Asylum Support Office said today that a decrease of 31% in the 27 member states, plus Norway and Switzerland, is mainly the result of emergency travel restrictions put in place during the coronavirus pandemic. In national news, back in the U.S., many Texans woke up to another day of a power crisis and issues with water systems due to a historic winter storm that brought record freezing temperatures in the state. Specifically, a lot of folks had damaged infrastructure and frozen water pipes, which means you're potentially dealing with dirty water. Residents were under notices to boil tap water before drinking it. This is, again, during days of record low temperatures. At least 2 hospitals in Austin, Texas were left without water and heat on Tuesday night, forcing patients and staff to transport human waste in trash bags and to refrain from showering or even washing their hands. That does not sound like a good combination. Transporting human waste in trash bags and not being able to wash your hands. Yesterday, Tesla CEO Elon Musk chimed in, slamming the Texas electrical grid operator for being unreliable after millions of residents were left without power. Hope he didn't accuse the Texas electrical grid operator of pedophilia like he sort of haphazardly did, or half stumblingly did, with that one dude he was blaming for not rescuing the kids in the cave. You remember what I'm talking about, Jamarl, the kid, the dude with the submarine.
I was like, that's somewhat of an inside joke. I was wondering how many people got that.
Exactly, yes. That's exactly what I was thinking. I'm like, that might be a little bit too esoteric. But anyway, Elon Musk chiming in on this one too. I'm not sure if he has a task force in plan to try to take over the Texas electrical grid, Black Ops style, but we'll see about that, Musk. Former President Donald Trump joined Hannity on Wednesday night to remember conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh, who died at age 70 after a long battle with lung cancer. Trump reflected on his decision to award Limbaugh the Presidential Medal of Freedom during the State of the Union address last February, just days after the conservative icon announced his stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis. I just want to put a little spotlight on this for a second. So Jamarl and I have gone back and forth on this, of course, on whether or not Trump was culpable for inciting insurrection, whether he should have been impeached, yada yada. He was just impeached, of course. He was not convicted. They didn't do the thing where they prevented him from taking future public office. But nevertheless, a lot of folk in our country and a lot of politicians certainly said that he did incite insurrection. In fact, a majority of the senators who voted said that he incited insurrection. And it's just weird. I'll just put it like this. It's just weird to me that at the same time as that happened, right after that, he's now on Fox News. It's just, does that make sense, Jamarl? It's just an interesting little coincidence of events. Whatever side you take on the issue.
Well, that they bring the people on Fox News, yeah. I mean, why wouldn't they? Fox News, that's their safe space, right? That's their safe space. And look, regardless of how we go back and forth on it, like you said, the majority voted against him. He just so happened couldn't get over that hurdle of that 60 vote majority. I mean, but even the likes of McConnell would say he's guilty. And so, they voted against him, but Lord knows. Look, I'll put it this way. I suspect if you got many of those Republicans into a quiet room, all sorts of hatred and bile will come out of them about Trump. Because I strongly suspect most of them are very angry at what he did. Even if they won't say it for political reasons, I bet most of them are very angry.
Totally. All right. Moving on into international news. Yesterday, senior journalist Priya Ramani was acquitted in a Delhi court of the criminal defamation charge that former federal minister Mubashir Jawed Akbar brought against her because of the Me Too sexual harassment allegation she submitted 2 years ago. Ramani had alleged that the former Minister of State for External Affairs had sexually harassed her during a job interview some 24 years prior in 1994. The judgment said, quote, sexual abuse takes away dignity and self-confidence. Right of reputation can't be protected at the cost of the right to dignity. The time has come for our society to understand that sometimes a victim may not speak for years because of the mental trauma. The woman cannot be punished for raising her voice against sexual abuse, end quote. 29 people have been detained across Catalonia in Spain due to protests over the arrest of rapper Pablo Hasél, who was convicted for, quote, slander against the crown, end quote, concerning his provocative song lyrics and social media posts. Many of the big cities in Spain are participating. In Madrid, police resorted to tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the protesters. Demonstrations began on Wednesday evening in the central square of the capital, Puerta del Sol, where citizens gathered in support of freedom of speech. Protesters demanded the immediate release of rapper Pablo Hasél, who was sentenced to 9 months in prison for glorifying terrorism and insulting the nation's monarchy. And this is after Pablo Hasél was using a university as a sort of temporary base and then was arrested from there. Anyway, it was a deeper story we'll have to come back to in more depth at sometime soon with a guest. Moving on, Olympics minister Seiki Hashimoto today resigned from her cabinet position in order to head the organizing committee for this year's Olympic Games. This follows the resignation of Yoshiro Mori, who, if you remember, had faced calls to step down after he said in closed-door talks that women talk too much, and a couple other similar sexist remarks, again in a closed-door meeting. The Olympic Games are currently scheduled to take place between July 23rd and August 8th, later this year. In tech news, in response to a proposed law forcing the tech giant to share revenue with outlets, Facebook removed posts of Australian news outlets and government pages, including those belonging to the Meteorology Bureau, the Pandemic Response, Mental Health, and Emergency Services. It's a big overstep for Facebook, in my opinion, but we can come back to opinion in a second.
This
came after the proposed...
But go for it. I'm sorry. Finish.
Well, this came after the proposed media bargaining law passed the lower house yesterday. In response, Josh Friedenberg has stated, quote, in respect to Facebook's actions today, Facebook was wrong, end quote. He noted that the blockage of Australians' access to government pages was, quote, completely unrelated to the media code, which is yet to pass through the Senate, end quote. And stated, but quote, but what today's events do confirm for all Australians is the immense market power of these media digital giants, end quote. Now, Jamarl, you're just saying you don't think this is a big overstep. What's your take?
Look, if I am Facebook, I would have did the exact same thing. If I'm the Australian government, I would have did the exact same thing. If that makes sense. At this point, it becomes adversarial. If you are just one out of how many other nations, and you're the only nation that does it, Facebook will put all sorts of pressure on them to get rid of that. Why wouldn't they do that? How is that not in their interest to do that? Facebook has how many other countries? And they are based, in the United States? Why wouldn't they put pressure on the Australian government? Look, all of the countries of the world gave them the authority to do this, gave them the power to do this, or you could say they took it. But yes, of course they're going to pressure the government to not do something that is in their fiscal interest. Why wouldn't they do that? Now, whether it's right or wrong is a secondary question, and that depends on whether you're Australia or whether you're Facebook. But yeah, it's infinitely foreseeable that Facebook would do this to put pressure on the Australian government. We gave them the power. Of course they're going to use it. What are your thoughts?
I think it's insane that they would do that, particularly while they got a pandemic going on. So doesn't this hamper the Australian government's ability to save lives during a pandemic? Admittedly, Australia is handling it a lot better than we are, than much of Europe is. So it's not like it's in as severe a state of crisis as folks across other oceans are. But nevertheless, aren't those deaths, if and when they come, aren't those deaths going to be on Facebook's hands for doing this?
How
you give the sort of realpolitik argument for it.
Responsibility for those deaths. Facebook is an internet company that basically allows, a billboard stuff. Australia decided that it wanted to go after those media companies. Whether that's right or wrong is secondary to the point that Facebook has every right in the world to be like, yeah, I don't want to participate and put pressure on the Australian government. It's not about saving lives. That's not Facebook's job. It's just not.
But to remove like a government page responsible for pandemic response during a pandemic in an unrelated business dispute,
yes.
That seems like it's overstepping. Again, that seems okay. You're making the realpolitik argument here. You're looking at this massive corporation competing with the government. I get it, but I mean, what isn't justified by that? Like if Facebook started ignoring this is a silly analogy, but if Facebook started ignoring the killings of people or organizing the killings of people in international waters of Australian civilians where there technically aren't laws on the books about it or whatever, is that justified? What isn't justified? Because if people die as a result of this, this is not something Facebook needed to do.
Facebook, those deaths are the responsibility of the Australian government. Australia has media. Australia has these other things that it could do. And hey, I keep hearing the argument that why don't they build their own system? They are a state, after all. They could do so. I'm just missing how this is Facebook's responsibility. Facebook's just showing information
because they're the ones who made the decision.
Yes. Well, wait. They made a business decision to leave Australia.
That wasn't a business. But that wasn't a business decision, as far as I can tell. Again,
it was to come back around and allow them to do this without necessarily that law.
Yeah, but that is a political. My point is that's a political decision. We've got to close this stuff out.
That is a business decision for Facebook.
Well, no, because here's the thing: it would be a business decision if there were.
That law costs Facebook money.
No.
How does that law not cost Facebook money?
Not Jamarl. You're not letting me get a word in here. It's okay. It's okay. We only have so much time, but it would be a business decision if, as they did, they removed the news outlets that would have cost them money. But in addition to removing news outlets, they removed government pages, which wouldn't have cost them any money to continue to host. And again, that's why those decisions to remove the pages are a political decision. They are not a business decision. They may be a political decision involving a business dispute, but they're not doing it to save money. They're doing it to extract political concessions from the Australian government. And that's why it's Facebook's responsibility. It's not that the Australian government pressured them and they had to respond by removing the government pages because they were about to start having to pay taxes on hosting those government pages or whatever. That's not a business decision. That is a political decision. Any quick response before we go into our break?
It's a decision for Australia. For Facebook, it's always a business decision. Always. Their highest priority is cash. Period. That's where they are. They're like every other business. If Australia is doing something that is going to hurt their profit model, the pressure that they put on Australia.
But then by that argument,
the pressure that they put on Australia to get them to relent on that is for them a business decision. That's the point I'm trying to tell you. For Facebook.
But it's just tautological. You're just saying that Facebook can't make political decisions because they're a company. But that's ridiculous. They are a business that deals in politics, as they are having to when they're dealing with this political body. They can do both.
No. When Facebook is making a choice, Facebook is making a choice on what is in their bottom line best interest. That's it. It's not for this kind of political nonsense. It's for what is in our business interest. If they can make a choice,
but this is also
I'll let you speak.
It is also about what you speak.
You're going to let me speak too. When they're making a choice and they're saying, look, you guys are costing us money in some way, and we're going to put pressure on the government to relent on that. You could call that politics, but what is their base reason for doing it? Their base reason for doing it is because you're costing them money on some level in the way that they're operating in your country. I guess I'm missing.
But it's the same damn it's the same damn thing for the Australian government. Why is the Australian government doing this? Because they want taxes, and they want to extract taxes from the media companies through being able to post on these stuff. Exactly. So is it? Well, but wait. Is it? We got to go into a break. Maybe we can revisit this later.
One is a government. The other one is a business. The government wants to extract concessions. Facebook doesn't like it and is trying to repudiate by pushing pressure on them. But for Facebook, it boils down to how much money we're going to lose or how much money we're going to gain. That's the only point I'm trying to make to you. It's not an absolute.
I think that's ridiculous. Okay. I think that's ridiculous. But we're close to 5 minutes over time here, so we
can have this fight later.
Close this out. We can. You're listening to Headlines on Fault Lines. We'll be back in a minute with the soapbox segment and Jamarl's monologue and our conversation of that. We'll be right back.
Fault Lines.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones with the historical context to tie them together? Well, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. If you want to join in on the conversation, you can, if you want to join in on the conversation, you can send a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. You guys and your engagement helps make this show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. There's an interesting thing that took place the other day, and there's a fight that is going on, and there's a fight that's going on that is actually a pretty good fight. Chuck Schumer and Elizabeth Warren has been pushing Joe Biden on this issue of $50,000 or eliminating $50,000 in student loans. If I may speak so boldly and speak for the entirety of African Americans, that's not to say that all African Americans agree with me, but it is to say that the majority would likely agree with me, especially in this country, that despite Joe Biden entirely willing, to cater to blacks in theatrical terms during the primaries and during the main election, Joe Biden, the man that was presented as king of blacks by Clyburn, at the very least, is failing those same blacks. To put it more plainly, Democrats need black supporters to get elected, and yet they don't want to support those supporters. There's a problem there. The problem and the reason is really straightforward. In the 60s, African Americans were put in positions of authority, and being put into those positions of authority, it was a mind-blowing thing. Whoa, they just put that black man into that position of secretary, or in that particular job, or in that particular faculty of government. That is mind-blowing, that's edgy. You even had the situation where in the movies, Captain Kirk kissing Uhura, and if you notice, they didn't even let him kiss her on his own steam. They had to have a being to force Captain Kirk to kiss Uhura, because again, it was the first kiss between a white man and a black woman on camera. You have the same thing with Cisco starting as commander, not captain, because the thought was that whites wouldn't accept him as captain. Or OJ running through the airport, and they're saying, wait a minute, do we really want OJ to do this? Because if you do, people may think he's running from the cops because he's a black man. I'm being serious, all of this is true. The thing is though, people get acclimated to it. They get acclimated to African Americans being in a position of authority. They get acclimated to Cisco being part of the best, at the very least in the last 3 or 4 years, of the best Star Trek and captain of that particular station. And yeah, they get used to African Americans and white couples, or African Americans and whites in relationships. Joe Biden even mentioned this at the debate. People hit him for this, but Joe Biden on some level is right about this. Media and entertainment has jumped on board for obvious reasons. It doesn't cost them anything. One, it expands the number of people they can cater to, and it expands their bottom dollar. It's a business decision. From the standpoint of politics, though, Joe Biden, Democrats, have been stuck in history on this. They're stuck in the past on this. And I would make the point that blacks are also. We need to go beyond the shiny object phase. Putting Kamala Harris up is nice. But again, as I speak for my kin here, it's unnecessary. Give us health care. Keep Kamala Harris. Give us student loan relief. Keep Kamala Harris. If you want to really get rid of the gap between blacks and whites in regards to income, or for that matter, if you want to help a large share of the people at the bottom, and I got to be honest, I don't care if they're white, black, gay, straight, or something in between, you can do so by eliminating student debt. The people at the bottom will be the people who will benefit the most. And whereas there are more whites that are in poverty, blacks are in a desperate level of that poverty. You could do this with one flick of a pen, in the way Chuck Schumer says. And on this, I'm being specific. Look, personally, I've made the argument that the people deserve Medicare for all because of the malfeasance of the government. Basically, it was the government's fault that nearly 500,000 people have died from COVID, or for that matter, 27 million are infected with COVID. It is entirely the government's fault. It was a malfeasance. Now, you can put that at the doorstep of Trump, but Trump was working in the capacity of president of the United States. And this notion of preserving or the behalf of the whole did not apply. It's deserved. It's owed. And if your name is Joe Biden and you're running to get elected and you can't get elected without the African American support in the numbers that they support, 90% for Hillary Clinton, 90% for like Joe Biden. And the best that you offer is the theatrical shiny object of Kamala Harris, who's half Indian, if I may bring that up. I guess I'm making the very basic point that if you want black support, and if blacks support the Democratic Party, they should not do so for nothing. They should not be a perfunctory choice. It should be a choice that you make because the party is doing something on your behalf. And on some level, this falls to a responsibility of blacks themselves. If when Joe Biden was running, you didn't accept Biden unless Medicare for all was on the table, unless elimination of student debt was on the table. Again, I don't care that it helps the lion's share of the population. Majority of the people that will be benefited by that are the poor and the middle class. And yet, Joe Biden, his argumentation against this avoids that very basic point. Let's hear the first clip. This is Joe Biden at the town hall. Notice Joe Biden says, I am willing to go big. Let's play the clip, Andre.
To passing $1.9 trillion bill, or is that final number still up for negotiation?
I'm committed to pass. Look, here's some of you are probably economists or college professors or you're teachers in school. This is the first time in my career, and as you can tell, I'm over 30, the first time in my career that there is a consensus among economists, left, right, and center, that is and including the IMF and in Europe, that the overwhelming consensus is in order to grow the economy a year, 2, 3, and 4 down the line, we can't spend too much. Now's the time we should be spending. Now's the time to go big.
Let's stop right there.
You may recall,
now is the time to go big. And what Biden makes the point of basically that during the Obama administration, he realized that by going too paltry in regards to the stimulus, that he basically undermined themselves in regards to trying to get the economy up and running. Good. I was like, yes, Joe Biden, on some level, even though it's not enough, he at the very least kind of gets it. But then he says this. Let's play the next clip about the 50K.
Loans are crushing my family, friends, and fellow Americans.
Me too.
The American dream is to succeed, but how can we fulfill that dream when debt is many people's only option for a degree? We need student loan forgiveness beyond the potential $10,000 your administration has proposed. We need at least a $50,000 minimum. What will you do to make that happen?
I will not make that happen.
Okay, stop it right there.
Depends on.
He's very blunt. I would not make that happen. The catch is Joe Biden has every power in the world to do this. As Chuck Schumer says, with a flick of a pen. Congress has granted Secretary of Education the legal authority to broadly cancel student loan debt under Section 432A of the Higher Education Act of 1956, which grants the Secretary the authority to modify, compromise, waive, or release the right, title, claim, lien, or demand, however required, including any equity or any right of redemption. The Department of Education has used this authority to implement modest relief for federal loan borrowers during the COVID-19 pandemic. This was used by Obama and it was used by Trump. But this power also allows them to eliminate student debt in its entirety, or the compromise 50K right here. This resolution recognizes the Secretary of Education's broad administrative authority to cancel federal student loan debt under the existing authorities of Section 432A. It calls on the President of the United States to take executive action to administratively cancel up to $50,000 federal student loan debt for federal student loan borrowers using existing legal authorities. It encourages the President of the United States to take executive action to use the executive's authority to use the Internal Revenue Code 1986 to ensure there's no tax liability. Because if they did that and got rid of the student loans, the federal government, meaning the IRS, will go after those students for the amount of those loans, saying that because the federal government got rid of it, it constitutes income that that individual got. And the IRS will go after those people. Joe Biden has every authority in the world to do this. The fact of the matter is there is no reason not to do this. If he is indeed running with this idea of King of Blacks and I'm fighting for African Americans and all this other stuff, start here. You have the power to do it. You want to go big, start here. Shane, what are your thoughts? We only have a minute or so because at this point we went very, very long in the first part. But yeah, we have a few minutes or so because the other guest is going to be running late. What's your thoughts?
We've got him actually. No, we've got Mikhail on now. We've got Dr. Kogan on. I think we. Yes. I think we should just go into our break. We can save this conversation for later. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with our next guest, Dr. Mikhail Kogan, on the other side of this break. Be right back.
Fault Lines.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Epidemics and pandemics could kill millions of people, and they actually did. Centuries ago, deadly outbreaks called the Black Death, the Plague of Justinian, and the Spanish flu ravaged countries, empires, and whole continents. Some of these diseases are still present around the globe. Others have become a thing of the past. Discover how these ancient and not so distant outbreaks from previous centuries differ from modern-day SARS, MERS, and coronavirus pandemics. Listen to our new series, Outbreak, the deadliest epidemics in human history. This week on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are getting into a conversation about vaccines and human challenge trials. A couple of different topics here. One, vaccines, why they're effective, variously effective against these new strains circulating. Two, where those strains have gone, specifically in the U.S. If we're looking at either the South African, the Brazilian, or the UK strain of COVID, where are they? Well, what's their status? We haven't heard too much about them in recent weeks. This is after we heard over a month ago that there was community spread of the strain from the UK in Colorado at the time. It was then soon reported that it was in more states. And at this point, I'm guessing that it started to spread throughout the population, but we haven't really heard about that for a while. So I wanted to bring on a doctor to talk about this. And then we'll come back to this. But also the UK has launched human challenge trials in which a number of young volunteers, it was 90 volunteers between the age of 18 and 30, are intentionally infected with COVID-19 to talk about the medical ethics of this, what it's being used for, why it's happening now. We are joined by Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He's the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute. That's a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. Dr. Kogan, thank you for joining us. How are you doing?
Good morning. Good morning. I hope my sound is okay today. I'm not home.
It is.
But, doing really well. Yeah, good.
Good to hear. Good to hear. Yeah, no, the audio quality is solid. Thank you so much for joining us here. Let's get into the conversation about vaccines. Jamarl and I were having this conversation. We were wondering, can you please give people a brief explanation? We got these new strains circulating, and we have like a half dozen different vaccines going around. Just looking at the batch, the batch available in the U.S. and in Europe through Russia, you have the Pfizer vaccine, the Moderna vaccine, the AstraZeneca vaccine, the BioNTech vaccine, Johnson & Johnson. You have the Sputnik V or Sputnik 5 vaccine from Russia. You got a handful here. And South Africa recently, which again has its own strain circulating, basically rejected the AstraZeneca vaccine, which they were due to purchase and start to distribute. They said they weren't going to do that because a study came out of the UK showing that it was less effective against their strain, against the South African strain. Instead, they have decided to purchase the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. They've got doses coming in and millions due a little bit over a month from now in late March. So for that conversation, I'm curious, how are these vaccines different from each other? Very simply, even the ones that are all mRNA, for instance, how are they differentiable from each other, and why would they have different levels of efficacy against these different strains? What's your take on this, Dr. Kogan?
Right. Well, so they're different vaccines. So the Pfizer and Moderna, of course, we discussed their new type of vaccine, which is called the mRNA vaccine, versus the AstraZeneca and now Johnson & Johnson are what's called a DNA or adenovirus old style vaccines. And, what we do know that at least in not just in the trials, but now also in the population settings, both Moderna and Pfizer appear to be quite effective. So Israel just published the data saying that indeed, in the real life, it appears that the mRNA vaccines are just as effective as they were claimed to be effective in the original trial, which, by the way, is quite unusual. Usually, a real-life scenario of any treatments, and vaccines are not any different, is usually not as good as when you do a clinical trial, and the reasons for that are pretty obvious. In real life, things tend to be much more messy compared to controlled trials where all the variables can be controlled. So that's a really good news. Now, it is surprising, I think, to some degree to say that only some vaccines seem to be more effective against the new strains than others. The target of the vaccine were pretty similar. So why are we seeing a difference? That probably is indeed partially technology and partially luck. I mean, I think there is some component of when the vaccines are designed, you cannot obviously predict how the mutations can occur. But I think generally it's just very concerning because we don't expect less variations in the future of the virus. We expect more. So is it possible that eventually the strain's going to start appearing that the current vaccines are not effective? I think it's not possible. I think it's just inevitable. I think it's the question of timing. If we're going to start seeing the strains 12 months from now, I'm pretty sure that the vaccine makers will have time to modify the existing vaccine. But if the frequency is going to be quite high and we're going to see changes on a monthly basis, which we hope, we don't really see that, I think, or I hope that it's not going to happen, then we're not going to be able to have enough time. I think it does appear that, at least for now, all the current variants seem to be still, it's not even clear if the AstraZeneca is just not responding at all. It probably is partially effective. Why the political decision was made not to purchase this for South Africa, that's I don't know exact details of it. It may be that they also felt, at least partially, that they want to get more effective vaccine and they were just canceling that contract trying to get another one. I mean, who knows? We'll see what that will be. We'll figure that out in the weeks to come.
That's still a bit disconcerting. I mean, it's basically dependent upon the momentum of mutation. Humanity will be able to compete or not against the virus. With the expectation being, though, that it's not going to mutate that fast. Especially now that the number seems to be going down in regards to the infections and the people who are dying from the infections. But that does bring up an interesting point, though. Why the very difference? It's a political decision to not buy the AstraZeneca, but the political decision makes sense if your society has somewhat of a variant that is not as responsive, or the AstraZeneca vaccine is not as responsive. What is the difference? I know there's mRNA in the traditional way they particularly make vaccines, though, but why are these things showing a varied efficacy? Is it because that would imply that there is a difference either in the materials, in the way that they're being made. I guess what I'm missing is, if a vaccine is being created, shouldn't that vaccine be equal across the board? And if it doesn't work against one variant, you wouldn't think, does that make sense? I guess I'm trying to get to it. It looks like there would be a certain standardized idea of the vaccine, but that's not what we're seeing. We're seeing some vaccines work better with some viruses, which implies that how those vaccines were created was different.
But that's how it always been, That's not this specific new disease is not any different than, let's say, a flu with that regard, right? And I think what's unique is that there's a different types of vaccines. In the past, let's say for the seasonal flu, we only had, we had different vaccines, but they were all the same technology. And then actually what's really striking is how good the efficacy has been so far. I would say we're just really lucky, because if you go back and you look at the, say, last 10 years of the flu vaccines, you would call 75% efficacy an unbelievably amazing luck for the year. And we had situations where some of the flu vaccines at the end of the season were less than 25% efficacious. That's horrible. I mean, that's worse than a flip of a coin, in essence. And, and that's why that was happening. Well, there's two things, right? I mean, so one is when you design the vaccine, you specifically try to design it against a small portion of the virus, because that's how they all made. That's whether it's RNA or DNA, that doesn't make any difference. And so you're trying to find the area of the virus that you think is going to mutate less, but you also think that it's going to have the most efficacy. So that part where when antibodies created, they're going to neutralize the virus most effectively at that specific area, or finding that specific area on the virus. But of course, you can't. It's not an exact science, any of this. And the technology part. What's I think unique here is I think the race was extremely tight, and it was a lot of resources were put into it on a very brief period of time. I think part of the problem in the past, the disease that was not that was already flu, let's say, existing for a long time. The investments into that from government sources was a lot less. So there was a lot of the the just general financial issues involved, right? So they had to make a vaccine cheap enough and effective enough so that a lot of people will get it. So there are other issues involved, not just all medical science, but just practicalities. Here we had a very unique situation. Now, what's also concerning is, I don't think anybody at this point think that this disease, the COVID, is going to go away anytime soon. We will learn how to live with this. The virus will keep mutating. But what's going to happen a couple of years from now? Let's say all the vaccines at that point are no longer effective, and the manufacturers now have to keep modifying the vaccine. Will the funding still going in? Will they be able to keep the prices low enough to vaccinate a lot of people? Will they be able to mass produce it to cover everybody? Who knows? We have so many questions that we can put out there, but we're not going to have any
2 minutes
for months and possibly even years. So,
Dr. Kogan, this is actually a pretty natural segue. We only have about a minute and a half left here, maybe a minute to respond. But let's talk about the human challenge trials. You're talking about the price we're going to have to pay going forward, understanding this virus as it continues to mutate and change over the course of not years but decades. What would the point of a human challenge trial be, where basically you infect somebody directly with the virus, as far as I can tell, to see how it takes its course in them, to see how they respond, to that virus spreading, as well as potentially to treatments? Is that broadly right? What's the point of this? And this seems a little bit fraught from a medical ethics perspective. But what's your take, Dr. Kogan, in about our last minute here?
That's the one hard question to answer in 1 minute. In terms of the importance, I think it's really important if this takes off. Why? Because currently the animal model for studying were really not quite robust. And the best way to study treatment is actually have a control setting of an infection like this. And, and then there's this whole ethics. This is potentially deadly disease. And, yes, it's much less deadly in young, healthy people, 18 to, say, 30 or 40, maybe even early 50s. But there's still deaths occur. So it's a hugely ethical, challenging issue. It's challenging.
But it's like you're saying though, it's more effective than studying it in animals. You're actually studying it in humans, and of course that we are the species we're trying to create vaccines and treatments for. Anyway, we're out of time. Dr. Kogan, thank you so much for joining us. Hey, for those listening, that was the voice of Dr. Mikhail Kogan. He is the medical director at the George Washington Center for Integrative Medicine, associate professor of medicine at George Washington University, and the founder and executive director of the AIM Health Institute. That's a Washington, D.C.-based nonprofit delivering integrative services to the underserved. If you're in the D.C. area, check them out, healthaim.org. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in just a minute.
Fault lines.
What's the most important hour of the day? It's the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon. On this show, we don't just deliver the latest headlines, we divide the real from the fake. Tune in to hear from some of the most brilliant political minds of today, get in-depth news and analysis that goes beyond the surface and dig straight into the details. Set your clock to the Critical Hour for a news perspective unlike any of those other guys. Tune in to the Critical Hour with Dr. Wilmer Leon, weekdays 6 to 7 p.m. Eastern, and catch us on Facebook Live. You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Fault lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We've been following the case in Myanmar of a coup against ousted leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Now, she was detained on February the 1st after the government basically charged her with unregistered walkie-talkies. This was a laughable charge and was basically viewed as a pretext for her arrest. Eyebrows raised that much more so on Tuesday when her lawyers told journalists that Aung San Suu Kyi had been charged with violating Article 25 of the National Disaster Management Law. It is not entirely clear how she apparently violated that law, but this is, again, being thought of as being a pretext for prosecution without prosecution, basically being able to hold her without necessarily going through the entire legal case of charging her, or for that matter, of a court case. Joining us to speak about this is a fascinating case because Myanmar had been basically under military rule for a while. Suu Kyi was basically the leader that took over after that, and it's a little bit distressing to see the coup take place and basically her deposed back to house arrest, where she was in house arrest for 15 years prior. Joining us to speak about this is KJ Noel. He's a journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is contributor to the book Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, is now available at iacenter.org. KJ, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
Now, did I describe that adequately, or is there anything else that you want to add to it? I guess I was trying to make the point that it seems like they're trying to put her back under house arrest.
Yes, I mean, it's clear that this is largely pretextual. These are political acts, and they're looking for pretextual reasons to hold her. Her initial detention was set to expire very soon. So with these new charges, they can hold her until March 1st. But the larger context, again, is that, first, the walkie-talkie thing has to do with the fact that the country is under constant civil war. There are 21 ethnic armed organizations, some which are really, really powerful armies, and there are at least 1,000 armed militia groups. So the government theoretically has a pretext to, kind of control the importation of technically, what could be used as war material. But this second charge, is clearly built out of thin air. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to hobble her for at least the year that they claim they need in order to put things back into order. And the reason for that, once again, the reason for their coup is, of course, the system in Myanmar was built by the military. At no point should we delude ourselves that democracy was won in Myanmar. The military gave a kind of civilianized system to the general population, and what they gave, they can take away, which is exactly what they did. But that said, they did have concerns about the election itself, and my thinking is that they think that when elections are held again, that they can pull out ahead and change the balance of forces.
And right now, I mean, military government at this time, and the word is there are hundreds of thousands of people on the streets with protests that have been accelerating. UN spectators are saying they're extremely worried about how this is going to fall out. If this comes to violence, what level of violence do you expect here? And what would come out of that? How much of a grip do you think the protesters can actually gain on the reins of power here? Or is this something where it's nominal pushback? What do you see coming out of this, KJ?
Well, I think that everybody's holding their breath. There's a lot of fear. People are not sleeping. And I think, the worst outcome, violent bloodshed, is a real possibility. One of the signals that leads many experts to believe that that's the case is that the counterinsurgency troops of the Light Infantry Division, this is Division 77, that were fighting the Arakan army in Rakhine State, have been pulled out of an active conflict, and they have been distributed into the main capitals. So purely from a psychological standpoint, it's terrifying. But the fact that you have, battle-hardened counterinsurgency troops in the streets, I think, is a very, very bad signal.
That's disturbing. To put it mildly, that's disturbing.
Yes.
And if you were living there, it would be disturbing. You know what I mean? To know that, that basically the military is trying to rip control back. And I do use the term rip control back. So right now, there are protests in the largest city of Yangon, the broken car protests. Basically, they drive their car in the street and say, oh, car's broken, they get up and leave. And apparently there are like thousands of these with the idea of slowing down the military and slowing down the police from what they're trying to do in regards to maintaining and instituting the coup, the military coup. Where does this go? I mean, like how far do you think they'll be willing to push this? I mean, are we talking about, you said bloodshed, are we talking about people being killed in the streets? And one thing that I do want to point out, it was, the military was at risk of losing power, I think. I mean, because if you think of the elections that they lost and the actions that Aung San Suu Kyi was taking in the political space, she was basically trying to pull the control away from the military into more democratic hands. And it seems that the military recognized what was taking place and responded as such. Now, is the public going to be okay with the military taking back control after the public recognized that it had some level of democracy, even if it was fledgling, even if it was on some level theatrical? It's still, you know what I mean? Like for example, if the president of the United States had a copy and they were using that copy because the president, the real one, had died. This was a movie. That president who's a copy has power. Even if the president is just theatrical, even if it's just for play reasons, that president has power because that president gets out there and responds to the population. I guess I'll look at Suu Kyi in similar terms. But even though the military basically relinquished a certain degree of control, she ended up with power. And she was trying to use the power that she had in that position to undermine the military to basically make it a democratic state. I guess what I'm asking is the public itself going to be okay with the military taking power? And it seems like if the military is going to escalate, the public also may escalate their pushback of the military regaining control.
It's a very complex scenario. And, at the risk of, muddying the waters too much, the first thing I would say is that the NLD does not have uniform support. And this has to do with, once again, the fact that Myanmar is a multi-ethnic state. And even during the elections, the government disenfranchised between 1.5 to 2.5 million voters. They prevented the second largest party from running. They charged an opposition candidate with sedition, and they reduced the number of parliamentary seats needed to form the government. And so there are actually a lot of ethnic minorities that are fairly pissed off at the NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, not the least of, would be the people in Rakhine State. So the military is not as blunt and as misguided as we might think it is. I think they're banking on the fact that they can, if they hold power for a year, defang the key power centers of the NLD, and then, look for their court or create alliances with various ethnic minorities, that they might actually have a chance at continuing the system as it is. Now, as it is, the system already gives 25% of the seats to the military, so they're already in a very strong position. They just wanted to fortify their position and prevent any further attrition. The other point that I will make is that Aung San Suu Kyi actually was very close to the military. Her father founded the Burmese military. She grew up on the laps of generals, and I think that there was a kind of hubris there, which she believed that by bringing the military close to her, that she would be able to slowly kind of take power for the NLD for herself. And that was shown in the first action she took, where she took 5 ministerial positions for herself. And then just very recently, she ignored 23 letters from the military asking her to address the election fraud. So there was a kind of way in which she overplayed her hand and misread the risk aversity or the risk-taking chances of the military. And I think this is why we've gotten to this stage. But it could end very badly. I think the military thinks that it can have a political solution, but I'm very concerned, and I think many people on the ground are concerned that this could end very badly with massive bloodshed.
And so, bringing this into the global political sphere, do you see the United States, China, India, other major powers with investments in the country, in the region, deciding to get involved if this gets to that point? If so, who do you think would land where? And we were talking about this the last time we spoke with you. You were talking about Myanmar as a main point of attention and contention between the United States and China, with the port as a major supply route for China's Belt and Road Initiative. What do you think would happen if this escalated to, bloodshed, to more extreme bloodshed? Who would get involved, and what would come out of that, KJ?
I think they're very there are a number of different scenarios possible. The U.S. hedged and put most of its bets on the NLD. They were taking down Aung San Suu Kyi after having put her into power. We can argue very clearly that in 2015 she got power because of the support of the U.S. Ambassador, who was an expert in elections and polling. But China has hedged its bets. It was actually closest to the civilian government, Aung San Suu Kyi, but they had also hedged their bets with the military and the ethnic armed organizations and the ethnic minorities that they associate with. So the Chinese will largely come out ahead. Now, they have asked for the restoration of civilian rule, but they're not going to be overtly interfere in Myanmar politics, because that's just not their style. On the other hand, the U.S. seems to be pushing the envelope, and I think the U.S. has a plan where it either wants the restoration of the civilian government under its terms, or it is not averse, as usual, to breaking the country into total chaos, which, as I pointed out, with 21 ethnic armed organizations and over 1,000 militia, that is very much a possibility.
And that would be true chaos. I mean, speaking of bloodshed, like you're talking about, and I'm hoping here that the protests don't escalate into not just pushback against the government, but squabbling, fighting, killings between these different groups who, like you said, many have vested interests and are pissed about what happened during the election. We're out of time, though. KJ, I want to thank you again for joining us. For those listening, that was the voice of KJ No, journalist, political analyst, writer, and teacher specializing in the geopolitics of the Asia-Pacific region. He is a contributor to the book, Capitalism on a Ventilator. Once censored by Amazon, that book is now available at iacenter.org. We'll be back in a minute. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. Be back on the other side of this break.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault Lines.
Live from the divided states of America, welcome to your daily inoculation for propaganda. In the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last antibody to a sick and seizing political system. Your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And in the independent corner, I am your political analyst, James Stranahan.
That would mean you are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. All right, let's get to the headlines. In the news, at least 2,471 new coronavirus deaths and 70,142 new cases were reported in the United States yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 77,661 cases per day, a decrease of 43% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And, as of this morning, more than 27,873,000 people in the United States have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 490,000 have died from it. We are quickly approaching the 50,000 or the 500,000 bar. And again, that is an undignified position to be in for this country. Life expectancy in the United States fell by a full year in the first half of 2020, a change experts say was fueled by the growing coronavirus pandemic. According to the CDC, the life expectancy for the entire population dropped to 77.8 years. Black men suffered the largest decline, with expectancy dropping by 3 years between January and June 2020. The Hispanic males saw a fall in line of expectancy of 2.4 years during that period. As we were mentioning in the first segment or the first half of the show, those are trends that are basically already ongoing. It's not so much that the death rate was going down, it was more so that there was a discrepancy in the death rate between blacks and whites. And look, I've made the point before, a lot of this has to do with environmental conditions. I would argue that all of it has to do with environmental conditions. If the United States was like Britain and Canada or some of these other countries that had healthcare systems, you wouldn't have seen this drop. The poorest person on the planet would have had, at the very least, the health of any random oligarch. On top of that, if you have suicides that are going up, if you have death rates that are going up from drug abuse, or for that matter, increases in drug abuse, you have to ask why. Is it possible that before COVID, 42% of the population living off of $18,000 a year have something to do with the stress that individuals endure throughout the course of their life, especially when it's ensconced in a certain degree of poverty? I would say that answer is yes. We've decided in this country, whereas wages haven't gone anywhere, you can make an argument, not just stagnant, but have dropped slightly over the course of 60, 70 years, that the moment that you offshore college debt to individuals as opposed to the state paying it in the way that it used to pay. The moment that you offshore, increases in healthcare. Basically, the things that go on in an individual's life has gone up in price, and more of those things have been offshored onto individuals with neoliberal policies of Democrats and Republicans. Are we really shocked that this would have a consequence on individuals when we put pressure and stress on individuals as they go about the course of their life? Are we really shocked by this? And I'm speaking from personal experience. I saw the stress that my mom was under. I saw the stress that families were under when they couldn't pay bills. Our neighbor couldn't pay the light bills, so his kid would sit there with a candle and do homework. Do you think that is beneficial to a child growing up? And I'm telling you, in areas like Chicago or Flint, Michigan, and I know they're not the only ones, you have impoverished areas. Those kids are drinking lead. Those people are showering in water that is ensconced in lead. Police in those areas also use tickets and fines in order to pay for those localities because they don't necessarily want to tax the wealth of the nation. Yeah, it goes beyond just the COVID thing. It goes into something that was already going on and trends that were already taking place. This is just, I suppose, the thing that tipped it over the curve. But be very clear, this was already proceeding. Shane, do you want to comment on this or you want me to keep going?
I would just keep going. There's a lot to lament here, but we have a lot more headlines too. So
yesterday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sharply criticized the, quote, wildly uneven and unfair, unquote, distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, saying 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccinations and demanding a global effort to get all people in every nation vaccinated as soon as possible. The UN chief told a high-level meeting of the UN Security Council that 130 countries have not received a single dose of vaccine and declared that, quote, at this critical moment, vaccine equity is the biggest moral test before the global community, unquote. The Secretary General called on the world's major economic powers in the group of 20 to establish an emergency task force to establish a plan to coordinate its implementation and financing. He said the task force should have capacity to, quote, to mobilize the pharmaceutical companies and key industries and logistic actors, unquote. That is laughable. I don't mean that in the sense that those countries shouldn't be able to get the vaccine. It is laughable that they thought that the richer countries were going to give the poor countries vaccines before any and all of their people are vaccinated. Whether you want to say this is right or wrong or not, it's almost irrelevant. It goes to the political whims of the nation. If your country is ensconced, is belabored by COVID-19, what does it look like for you to say we're going to take part of that and give it to another country when your citizens have not been vaccinated, or when you are under pressure to get those people vaccinated? When Joe Biden says, hey, teachers should get vaccinated, okay, Joe Biden, who are you going to take it from to give the teachers? I hope you get my point. It is difficult, if not impossible, politically, for them to give vaccines to other countries before their populations are vaccinated. This is no different than any other poverty or wealth condition. In this very specific instance, the U.S. and other countries were never going to do that, despite the rhetoric. It's just rhetoric. Applications for asylum in the European Union dropped by more than 30% in 2020 compared to the previous year, reaching their lowest level since 2013. The European Asylum Support Office said today that a decrease of 31% in the 27 member states, plus Norway and Switzerland, is mainly the result of emergency travel restrictions put in place during the COVID pandemic. Many Texans woke up to another day of power crisis and issues with water systems due to a historic winter storm that brought record freezing temperatures in the state, or should say to the state. Residents were under notice to boil tap water before drinking it after days of record low temperatures that damaged infrastructure and froze water pipes. At least 2 hospitals in Austin, Texas were left without water and heat on Tuesday night, forcing patients and staff to transport human waste in trash bags and refrain from showering or even washing their hands. That is utterly disgusting. Yesterday, Tesla CEO Elon Musk slammed the Texas electrical grid operator for being unreliable after millions of residents were left without power. Here's the thing. If you got hit with a bad storm, let's say a hurricane, you in Maryland or Virginia are also not safe from having those conditions. And I'm saying this from personal experience. I ended up in a hospital, I forget which year this was. Richmond gets hit with a major hurricane. Virginia does, or the coast, East Coast. The hospital that I was in, I can't remember if it was Richmond Memorial or Retreat, lost water, lost power, and was on backup generator. The water was off. At this point, I am in the hospital and I am so ill that I am throwing up blood every 30 minutes. Now, you can imagine this is a problem, right? If you don't have water, you don't have the capacity of the flesh, and yet the individual is getting sick of the stomach of blood every 30 minutes, like clockwork. The nurse comes in, give my mom a bucket, a paper towel, and that is basically what she gave my mom to use for the entirety of the night because, again, they didn't have water. This is not just Texas. I guess my point is disabuse yourself of this notion that this is just Texas. We are all on the hook for this because the infrastructure and the money that we invest in infrastructure is not up to snuff. That's the reality. So people can attack Texas for it, fair enough, and Texas should be blamed for it. But that is a country issue, that we don't devote enough resources to our infrastructure. Just pointing it out. Former President Donald Trump joined Hannity on Wednesday night to remember conservative radio show host Rush Limbaugh, who died at the age of 70 after a long battle with lung cancer. Trump reflected on his decision to award Limbaugh the Presidential Medal of Freedom during the State of the Union address last February, just days after the conservative icon announced stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis. If anything, I like the fact that Trump gave Rush Limbaugh the Medal of Freedom because I like that it points out how political, how propagandistic, and how utterly ludicrous some of the people who get that medal is. The idea that you're going to give that to Rush Limbaugh is embarrassing. Rush Limbaugh has spent his life living to the detriment of this country, let alone this world. And look, people may dislike me saying this, but Rush Limbaugh did the world a favor when he dropped dead. That is brutal, and yet I would say look over the course of Rush Limbaugh's life and ask yourself whether he's been a positive to this earth or not. An honest evaluation comes back with a not. Shane, am I being too much of am I being too hard on this? Should I be more forgiving for the dead? And by the way, I'm consistent. When my grandfather died, I had the same perspective. Worst person on the planet. Why are these people getting up there saying otherwise? So I'm consistent on this. When I drop dead, you can get on this radio station and say the exact same thing. I would promise you I won't care one iota. What do you think, Shane?
Well, you wouldn't be around to care, but no, I wouldn't say that. I mean, that's up to you, man. You're not sentimental about this stuff, but that comes with a realistic appraisal of reality that, does you a benefit as a spectator, as an analyst, as a radio host, all that stuff. I don't personally have a take one way or the other. I tend to not say that kind of thing about people after they just passed, but so I'm not going to say that about Rush, but I get where you're coming from.
Fair enough. Each his own. Yesterday, senior journalist Priya Ramani was acquitted in Delhi court of the criminal defamation case that former federal minister Mobasha Jawad Akbar brought against her because of the Me Too movement sexual harassment allegation 2 years ago. Ramani had alleged that the former Minister of State for External Affairs had sexually harassed her during a job interview in 1994. The judgment said, quote, "Sexual abuse takes away dignity and self-confidence. Right of reputation can't be protected at the cost of the right to dignity. The time has come for our society to understand that sometimes a victim may not speak for years because of mental trauma. The woman cannot be punished for raising her voice against sexual abuse." Now, the question that people should be asking is, why is this a story at all? And in America, you may ask, why is this a story at all? The reason is because the Me Too movement, even though it hit here in the United States, in India, the sexual harassment thing, even rape, was one of those things that wasn't entirely punished. I remember this guru, CiA, I can't think of his last name, but basically being asked this question about rape and about the society itself that would allow such a thing. The fact that a judge is coming out this was in India is somewhat of a big deal. So good on them, for them. Everybody has their challenges. Everybody has their movements in regards to societies. This is theirs. 29 people have been detained across Catalonia, Spain, due to protests over the arrest of rapper Pablo Hasél, who was convicted for, quote, slander against the crown, unquote, concerning his provocative song lyrics and social media posts. Many of the big cities in Spain are participating. In Madrid, police retorted to tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the protests. The demonstration began on Wednesday evening in the central square of the capital, Puerta del Sol, where citizens gathered in the support of freedom of speech. Protesters demanded the immediate release of rapper Pablo Hasso, who was sentenced to 9 months in prison for glorifying terrorism and insulting the nation's monarchy. You know, art is always subversive when it's done right. It just is. And that subversive quality often runs up against the state. It's no different. Olympics minister Saiko Hashimoto today resigned from her cabinet position in order to head the organization committee for this year's Olympic Games. This follows the resignation of Yoshiro Mori, who had faced calls to step down after he said in closed-door talks that women talk too much. The Olympics Games are scheduled to take place between July 23rd and August 8th later of this year. Those are your headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com.
Yo, Deshaun, what do you want to talk about today?
Well, Bob, that's easy. I want to talk about the need to stop the development of self-driving cars.
Again, Sean, you're driving me nuts. I think the self-driving car thing's already out of the gate.
No. It's never too late. See, now the leading experts in the field, just pick one, whichever one, leading experts have repeatedly warned us about the dangers of artificial intelligence. Look, I'm telling you, man, we have to stop the robots by any means necessary.
I see what you did there.
Yep.
Tune into our show By Any Means Necessary daily from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Time on Radio Sputnik. And don't forget to call in at 3:20 p.m. to our studio number 202-521-1320.
And if you miss us live, check us out on SputnikNews.com, Spreaker, iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts to stay up to date on the latest political, social, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back.
And we are back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we are getting into a conversation about Andrew Cuomo, governor of New York, and Joe Biden after they met last week. After this new report had come out, I will get into this, and basically they didn't talk about what Cuomo had been doing wrong when they had their meeting. We're going to be talking more about this to give people some of the backstory in case you haven't been following this as closely. Andrew M. Cuomo, governor of New York, presided over the nation's largest crisis in its coronavirus response, as thousands, tens of thousands of people were dying really quickly last year during the spring, early summer from COVID. New York City became the hotspot in the U.S. and arguably the hotspot in the world. Andrew M. Cuomo, obviously the governor of the state, handling this crisis. Going into the summer, the media and the Democratic Party saw him as not somebody who had bungled it, but as somebody who had done an effective job at leading his state through the crisis, with the total COVID rate going down, New York's economy admittedly taking a huge hit, but nevertheless, the narrative was he was doing a good job. He was doing regular press briefings, sort of Roosevelt-style fireside chat-like press briefings where every day he was talking to folks. He later got an Emmy for those press briefings. Anyway, fast forward a bit. A couple of weeks ago, late January 28th specifically, New York's Attorney General Letitia James releases a report saying that basically the main takeaway is the state had underreported the amount of people who had died in nursing homes radically. They did a 50% undercount, where they misrepresented the number of deaths happening in those nursing homes. Now, as if that's not bad enough, last week, a week ago today, an aide to Cuomo came out and in a private meeting with Democratic lawmakers told them basically, I'm sorry, we're sorry for this. We were undercounting those deaths. We froze because we were worried about a response from Trump's Justice Department. Now, Cuomo had engaged in a war of words with Trump for months while the crisis was going on. Basically, the takeaway from this is his administration undercounted those deaths intentionally in order to evade further scrutiny by Trump's administration. Now, Cuomo meets with Biden last week. This is after this report about the aid statements came out. And in that meeting, they do not discuss any of this. They don't discuss the undercounting of the nursing home deaths or him trying to evade the scrutiny, any of that stuff. Biden does not bring it up. And of course, Cuomo doesn't either. To discuss this, to look at the consequences of this, to talk about whether Biden will ever choose to investigate this, whether he'll ever have his Justice Department sicked on Cuomo, we are joined by Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist, frequent guest of this show, also an essayist, syndicated columnist. You can follow him on Twitter at Ted Rall and check out his cartoons and articles at rall.com. Ted, thank you for joining us. How are you doing this morning?
I am doing better than those undercounted dead people in the nursing homes. I am fine.
You are above ground, which is a lot better than a lot of those folks are doing, sadly. Not sad for you, yeah. but thank you for being with us. Let's talk about this. Will Biden ever choose to do anything on this? It seems to be, I mean, I don't know if the media is ever going to portray it this way, but it could have been cast as Trump cracking down on a governor in, a purely political dispute at the time, with Biden in the administration not even talking about this in their meeting last week, instead giving Cuomo a lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars for New York's infrastructure and COVID response and the transit system, all this stuff. He gave him money instead of asking him the hard questions. Is there ever going to be a reckoning from this? Is Biden ever going to do anything on this? What's your take, Ted?
Well, it's hard to know whether the president or his DOJ has any integrity. But if they do, then they will have to continue. They'll have to further investigate, even go further than Trump would have. This is a scandal, it was a deliberate undercount for political partisan reasons, and it had material effect on the way that epidemiologists assessed the spread of the disease. It probably cost many lives at other nursing facilities in other states who were unable to learn from the experience of the rapid spread in New York. It literally cost many lives, and it's a very serious matter. Here in New York, I'd be very curious to see tracking polls on Cuomo's popularity, but I can just say anecdotally that many people I know who thought that he walked on water just can't stand him now. A year ago, we were talking about him as a potential presidential nominee. Now they're talking about how he should go to prison.
Yeah, that was the argument I made too. He has to be prosecuted, or at the very least investigated, potentially. Because it does sound like he was trying to dodge a federal investigation by Donald Trump, or potentially the Trump administration. Now, he was using it for political football, don't misunderstand me. By the same token, DeRosa was very clear that the reason that they were doing this was because they basically froze when they didn't want to deal with the federal investigation. Right here, Ms. Rosa said that the Trump administration had turned nursing homes into, quote, into a giant political football, unquote, and receiving the Justice Department's requests, we basically froze. But it wasn't just froze. That information had to be ripped out of their hands. Right here, this is even this quote by the New York Times is astonishing. Since then, the number of deaths connected to New York's nursing homes and long care facilities has only ballooned to about 15,000 confirmed or presumed dead from 12,743 in late January. Within a few days, it ballooned. Right here, the administration released the latest figures as a result of a court order following a 6-month battle between Cuomo administration and the Empire Center, a conservative-leaning think tank. He didn't even give it up. It was something that was ripped out of his hands. How is the media space taking this in New York? Because like you said, at one point, he was doing these briefings. At one point, they thought Cuomo walked on water. And now, not so much. And to make this worse, the reporting came out, I think it was yesterday, that Cuomo was threatening an assemblyman, last name Kim, because he was angry that Kim was attacking him on the nursing home issue. Isn't that astonishing? So how is the media space in New York appropriating this information? Meaning, how is this going down to the media?
Well, it's if anybody ever saw The Taking of Pelham 123, which is a brilliant political satire, I'm talking about the original version from the 70s. They say, okay, well, some version of, the Post will hate you, the Daily News won't take a side, and the Times will have your back. That's pretty much the way it is here. The Times has been playing softball. They have dutifully reported the fact that Cuomo is being criticized, but interestingly, they're noting the fact that he's being criticized from his left flank. There's a lot more progressives in the state assembly than you would think. And so he is getting pressure both from the progressive wing of his state Democratic Party as well as the GOP. And, those progressives have been kept down by the centrist Cuomo DNC machine for a long time. So, now the knives are coming out of the togas, now that Cuomo's looking weak. So the Times can't ignore the story, and they're not, but they're definitely soft-pedaling it. The Post is rabid, Rupert Murdoch-owned conservative, pro-Republican editorial page, and they are just having a field day. This is like the Hunter Biden story, however. They do happen to have the benefit of being right on this issue. And the Daily News is a democratically aligned, kind of just sort of being wishy-washy and not having much to say. All media sort of stems from those three old-fashioned print dead tree newspapers. And so you'll see local NPR, like WNYC, Brian Lehrer, is doing a good job on this. He's a progressive. You're seeing, but then you'll see like other talk radio just not really touching it, and or if they're more conservative leaning, they're going after Cuomo. I think Cuomo's in big trouble, and it's not because specifically of this scandal as much as it is the fact that he's been offending a lot of people for a long time, and now this is their chance to get him.
But is that going to turn into a lack of reelection next time around? I mean, you've said that you thought that he wouldn't have any serious problems until his approval rating dove into the 30% category, 35, 36%, something like that. Does that still hold, or do you think he has less of a chance now? What's your take, Ted?
Well, it's been a long time since we had a Republican governor. I think George Pataki, if memory serves, was the last one. And so even though upstate New York, which is most of the state, is conservative, New York City and the suburbs are so Democratic that he's going to have to mess up and plunge even more to become vulnerable to a Republican challenge. But what I was thinking is that a strong AOC-like primary challenge could really do him in if current trends continue. That's, of course, the biggest caveat in the world. Current trends don't usually continue. But if they do, I think he could be very vulnerable to a left flank challenge. The question is, would there be someone prominent enough who's able to take the slings and arrows of the Cuomo political machine? And it is an old-fashioned machine.
Well, that's what I want to get into, the machine aspect of this. In the report that just came out against Cuomo, when he was basically attacking Assemblyman Kim, he basically made the point that he was going to destroy Kim because Kim was criticizing him on the issue of the number of nursing home deaths. He even called Kim and apparently spent 15 minutes screaming at him for giving quotes to the various news agencies and news organizations. He went out and made the point of saying that Kim was doing something unethical, if not illegal. And this was during the time that Kim was basically saying, look, Cuomo has undercounted the number of dead people. Like, that's astonishing. Basically, he was trying to use that political machine to destroy his opposition. How effective would that be this time around, though? I mean, because if you're right, and if people who really liked him at this point are like, what he did was disturbing, if not illegal, is that political machine effective in this sort of political climate? It seems that Democrats would have to distance themselves from him on this point. That's kind of what I'm getting at.
Well, right now, I think, the Fuhrer is still the Fuhrer, right? I mean, he might be in the bunker, but, there's just it's all about who comes next and who can topple the king. Right now, nobody knows. So I think the loyalty and of the machine remains strong. I think everyone's in wait and see mode. They want to see if there's an investigation. They want to see if some kind of news event distracts us from this scandal. Americans do have extremely short memories, and you can always sort of count on that. I mean, we're living in an age like if Elliot Spitzer came back and ran for governor again, I think he could beat Cuomo. It's a different. So it's just. It's a long time between now and the primaries, but it's, right now I'd say it's really 50-50, and that's more that's a big deal. I mean, Cuomo was really unimpeachable. As you mentioned, in the lead 9 months ago, he literally wrote the book on COVID response, and he won an Emmy, and now he's really down in the trenches, and he looks like dirt. And rightly so.
Let's do this. Let's take you out a little bit early, because 2 minutes is usually not enough time to get a question and a response back. So the voice that you guys are listening to is Ted Rall, a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall and read his cartoons and articles at Rall.com. This is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Great job. Even better. Let's get one more, just to be sure.
Are you a young photographer the world needs to know? Bring your images to more eyes through the Andre Stenin contest. Open to both artists and photojournalists, there are dozens of categories to enter and compete for a share of serious prize money. And, more importantly, international recognition of your work. Learn more about how to enter at stenincontest.com. Point, shoot, win.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you out of the Capitol in Washington, D.C. We have been discussing the issues with Cuomo and basically the political crisis that Cuomo has gotten himself into, undercounting the number of deaths in nursing homes by basically half, and having to have that ripped out of his hands in a lawsuit. Shout out to the Attorney General bringing this case up and bringing this to limelight, but also, and I don't mean to pop the collar, shout out to us, because we were on this issue for weeks, and we were absolutely 1,000% right, as mainstream media basically gave all sorts of accolades to Cuomo, who sleeps on his pillow apparently nicely. But moving on for the moment, I want to get into a conversation that we had for the monologue, and this goes into Joe Biden's town hall. That town hall, from the standpoint of lefties, was embarrassing. There were aspects of it that Joe Biden was good. There were other aspects that were strange. And there were other aspects that were greatly unfortunate, especially within the context of the power that Joe Biden has, and considering that we are in the midst of a pandemic with nearly 500,000 people dead as a result of government malfeasance. Let's take a listen to the first clip. And this is Biden talking about he's going big. And for this, I was applauding. I was like, yes! Let's play the clip, Andre.
To passing $1.9 trillion bill, or is that final number still up for negotiation?
I'm committed to pass. Look, here's some of you probably economists or college professors or teachers in school. This is the first time in my career, and as you can tell, I'm over 30, the first time in my career that there is a consensus among economists left, right, and center that is and including the IMF and in Europe, that the overwhelming consensus is in order to grow the economy a year, 2, 3, and 4 down the line, we can't spend too much. Now's the time we should be spending. Now's the time to go big. You may recall I managed the last experiment we had with stimulus, and it was no, I don't mean it that way, but it was $800 billion. We thought we needed more than that. And we think we did. It ended up working, but it slowed things up by about, and depending who you talk to, between 6 months and a year and a half.
That sounds great. It's like, whoa, Joe Biden got it. He made up for the mistakes in the past. And then he says this. Let's play the clip.
Loans are crushing my family, friends, and fellow Americans.
Me too.
The American dream is to succeed, but how can we fulfill that dream when debt is many people's only option for a degree? We need student loan forgiveness beyond the potential $10,000 your administration has proposed. We need at least a $50,000 minimum. What will you do to make that happen?
I will not make that happen. It depends on whether or not you go to a private university or a public university. It depends on the idea that I say to a community, I'm going to forgive the debt, the billions of dollars of debt for people who have gone to Harvard and Yale and Penn and schools. My children, I went to a great school, I went to a state school. But is that going to be forgiven rather than use that money to provide for early education for young children who come from disadvantaged circumstances?
Right there for a moment.
But here's what I think.
Look, the number of people who are going to school in Harvard, Penn, or whatever, I would imagine those parents aren't dragging a bill along. And even if they were, it's not the same thing as the overwhelming majority of kids that are poor and middle class who are in college, who are stuck with those bills, $50,000 back when they're teenagers, many of which can't pay for it because many of which didn't get to finish school. That is a weird dodge, considering that what Biden is talking about is basically a top 1 or 2%. Let's give them the benefit of the doubt, top 5%. And I would wager to you that the poor and the middle class would have no issue with paying for those kids. To talk about this, or to discuss this commentary about the 50,000, but also to discuss the larger commentary about Joe Biden's at the town hall, we have continuing to join us, Ted Rall. Ted Rall is a political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. Ted, thank you for joining us. What do you think of that, Ted? Because honestly, the truth of the matter is Biden does have the authority to get rid of 50,000. In fact, Joe Biden has the authority to get rid of all of it. The 50K is a compromise. And just to add this in, Congress has already granted authority to the Secretary of Education, the legal authority to broadly cancel student debt under Section 432A of the Higher Education Act of 1965, which grants the Secretary the authority to modify, compromise, waive, or release any title, claim, lien, or demand, however required, including any equity or any right of redemption. Meaning, and to put it in broad terms or strict terms, Joe Biden, if he wanted to, could eliminate all student debt. And the 50,000 is basically a compromise. What do you think about him? I want to go big, but not really big. What do you think about this kind of weird political fight on this point? Joe Biden should just get rid of the 50K and call it a day.
Well, I mean, this is very personal to me because I kind of lived this story. I was a scholarship kid, got to go to a great school, and I graduated with about $25,000 in student loans that were supposed to be payable in 10 years, but I wasn't able to because there were recessions, I lost jobs, I had trouble paying my rent. So I took forbearances and delays, and I didn't end up being able to pay all that stuff off till about 17 years. I was paying, so just think about that. I was back in the 80s and 90s, I was paying, about $800 a month. That's a lot of money. It still is. And it really stopped me from, I got married later. I couldn't buy a car. I mean, I couldn't help stimulate the economy. I couldn't consider doing volunteer work or taking a non-paid internship or joining the Peace Corps. I couldn't, I was stuck financially. And things were much better for me than they are for kids, for millennials. I mean, they're graduating with an average of $33,000 in debt, which doesn't sound that much more. However, they have much higher interest rates. I was paying 5% interest rates and 9% interest rates. Some kids are paying like 18, 19, like credit card rates on these student loans. It's a massive profit center for the banking industry. And I think Biden's taking advantage of this sort of cultural, anti-intellectualist attitude in American politics that says that college students are kind of namby-pamby and like they're privileged, and especially if they go to Harvard or Yale. I mean, let's get real. Even if you count private schools, I mean, I went to an Ivy League school. I went to Columbia. But there are only 8 Ivy League schools. And if you throw in like another, say, 30 or 40 highly elite schools in the country, 99% of American kids who go to 4-year private schools are not going to elite.
It's a ridiculous dodge. I mean, it's like you're invoking Harvard. And let's say for the moment that the top 1% can go to these schools. They can afford it. And they may pay those bills, meaning the people who are dragging a bill along, regardless of what school they're going to, the overwhelming majority are poor and middle class, because from the standpoint of the poor and middle class, they look at it as a way of getting into the higher income brackets or having a decent life. We also should point out that Joe Biden is responsible for making sure that those loans can't be discharged to bankruptcy. Like there's all sorts of layers to this. And, one more point, the rich are American also. They pay their taxes just like everybody else, even though they don't pay enough. So why shouldn't we include them in this? What's the issue in including them in this? It's like the reason and the argumentation against this just seems weak. And, I keep making the point, Joe Biden ran like he was king of blacks, getting all the credit in the world, got like 90% black support. And if you're talking about the people who are going to, definitely, if you're trying to get rid of the income gap, this is one of the key ways of doing it.
It's also good politics for the Democratic Party. I mean, the system is set up. There are social welfare programs for the poor. There's corporate welfare programs and low taxes for the rich. But the middle class, with some justification, constantly feel like they don't get much. And, making it a little easier for them to send their kids to college so that for strivers to get ahead and go out and to the world, earn more, which means that they pay more higher taxes and spend more, which means they also, they stimulate the economy and also pay sales taxes. That's good. That seems like a good deal for the economy. It seems like good politics. Certainly, I'm very sympathetic to the idea that we have massive poverty, and that's always job one. But, it's also ridiculous to say that we can't afford it at a time when Biden is looking at reneging on the peace deal with the Taliban and wants to expand the war in Afghanistan. Hey, you want to save some money, stick to that deal. Get out of Afghanistan.
But I mean, another side of this is it depends on what people are studying, doesn't it? I mean, I don't mean to get too personal. I didn't go to college, went to community college, decided not to go to university because of the cost, because I saw, okay, there's tens easily many tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of dollars of debt I would have to go into. I knew how to do some stuff. I taught myself web development. And so I decided to sort of go it alone, and that worked decently well. Anyway, I mean, I don't mean to get caught up in my personal story, but it depends on what you're going to study. It depends on whether you're talking about sales tax and the follow-on effects, the second and third order effects from getting a diploma and moving up into a higher paying job. But doesn't it depend on what that job is centered? And this is admittedly a complaint that many have already lodged in innumerable quantities against the higher education system in the States, where people are focusing on unprofitable diplomas. They're getting diplomas in whatever random field of social science or social study and expecting that to get them a high-paying job, when in reality, if that's doing something, that should be enriching them personally, intellectually, and philosophically, and spiritually, in whatever ways that it does, not necessarily making them money. I mean, isn't there this confluence of, on the one hand, people trying to get degrees in order to be effectively more prestigious is the sort of cynical way of looking at it. You're getting an interesting degree that makes you feel better about yourself, makes you feel better about who you are in the world. And at the other hand, at the same time, not realizing, or at least not admitting to themselves fully, that they're taking on an immense cost. What they can foresee in advance would be an immense cost. I mean, I agree, it would be much better if our education system were much cheaper, if not free. And on the other hand, if we didn't have long-run wage stagnation that forced people who'd spent 4, 6, 8, however many years in college to go into a low-wage job on the other side of that. But isn't there an element of personal responsibility too here? Isn't there something about how people should be foreseeing that what they're doing in advance isn't necessarily the wisest thing? Now, society might take that up. It shouldn't be on any one kid to realize this is a scam, which to me it is. But what's your response to that, Ted? What do you think?
Well, I wrote a very famous essay called "Colleges for Suckers" back in the 90s. So that's where I weigh in on it. I do think it's a scam. The problem is that how much personal responsibility can there be when we're talking about children who are 17 years old and can't even be tried for crimes in adult court in reasonable states? I mean, I remember signing those student loans agreements. I had just turned 17. I didn't have any experience at all. I had no ability to rationally decide what the most logical major was, even though I talked to people. And it's, and the information you get is often, correct at the time, but then it's out of date by the time you graduate 4 years later. I went into engineering school. By the time engineering seemed like a pretty solid profession. By the time I graduated, there were no jobs in engineering. It turns out it's very cyclical. Nobody knew that, or if they knew it, they weren't telling me that. I think you can't hold 17-year-old kids responsible for making the kind of rational, 2020 hindsight vision decisions that by the time I was 30, I was able to see like much more clearly. The truth is, I don't think it really makes a lot of sense to go to college unless you are pursuing the kind of accreditation that's going to allow you to pursue a career that you would not otherwise be able to get. You need a degree to practice architecture, for example. But, history, you don't. And, you can just read history. So it's just, there's a lot of pieces to it. But, personal responsibility shouldn't enter into it. We're just talking about
it. Ted, I don't think personal responsibility applies at all. It just seems out of whack. Ted, would you like to stay with us to continue this conversation for another 15 minutes or so? We're going to bring in the audience to call in and everything else. You don't have to. That's not a push or anything else. And it's not, Margaret Kimberly yesterday was like, no. So you're perfectly willing, perfectly open to say no to this. It's just an offer.
I'm going to make a rational decision. And
Fair enough.
Okay.
Thank you, Ted.
Absolutely. All right. So the voice that you guys have been.
Let's close this out.
Close this one out. The voice that you guys have been listening to is Ted Rawl, political cartoonist and syndicated columnist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rawl and read his cartoons and articles at raw.com. You guys are listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, and we'll be back. We'll be taking calls when we come back. 202-521-1320. Fault Lines, Thomas and Stranahan. We'll be back in a moment.
Fault Lines. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Stuck in traffic? No problem. Stay informed. Stay tuned to Radio Sputnik on 105.5 FM or 1390 AM in the Washington, D.C. area. Need more? Follow us on Facebook or check us out on SputnikNews.com.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. And we are accepting calls. 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. If there's a topic that you want to talk about, if it's a topic you want to broach, feel free, keep it PG. But other than that, we are open to conversation. I want to jump back on what we were talking about with Ted Rawl and the conversation at Biden about the 50K. Look, personally, I don't think personal responsibility comes into play. And personal responsibility is often a dodge that is used to basically put something on human beings. As a collective, it is to the betterment of our society, indubitably so, to have people to go to school and get an education. And when you're looking at many of the people who are poor and who are middle class, again, 42% of the public made $18,000 a year. That number is already monstrously low. You take it to most people don't have $500 in the bank. And then we go into, personal responsibility and trying to get ahead in life. Most people use college as a means of getting ahead. Not everybody continues or graduates. And because not many or everybody graduates, you have a situation where people get stuck with a college bill despite the fact that they didn't get the degree. People take the risk. They take the chance. Because not taking the chance puts them in a situation where they consider to be impoverished. And understand, keep in mind, from the time that child is a baby might be strong, hyperbolic, but to the time the kid goes through school, their counselors, their teachers, their principals, all of them are saying, go to college. We consider going to college as an esteemed event in this country. And yet, and because of such, when it gets to it, colleges, universities, and some people decide, hey, we can make a buck off of children. We can put $15,000, $20,000, $30,000 of debt on their backs while they're teenagers, and we can hold it out like they have no other alternative to get past. Joe Biden makes the point that colleges, state colleges, and community colleges should be free. Yes. And if you want to make the argument or the delineation between private colleges, fair enough, do it. But you should also get rid of the debt. you at the very least give people a starting point where they don't necessarily have to start from 50,000. And more importantly, when people have that choice of going to school, they can make the practical choice. They can do due diligence and personal responsibility and choose the state college or the community college as a way of getting an education without taking the $50,000 bill. Now, Shane, you disagree with me on this, I think. Look, rich people are Americans too. And this notion of putting in, $100,000 and making this much or that much, rich people are Americans also. And as such, I don't see why they wouldn't be included into the notion of paying off student loans. They, after all, put a large amount of money into the coffers of the federal government from the standpoint of taxes. They are also eligible. I don't buy this argument that Democrats often use of separating one American from the other American in order to create a wedge in a plan itself, and honestly, underpinning the breaking of that plan. If you're making $100,000 and you say, well, wait a minute, I make $101,000, my kid isn't eligible. You can always do that. It always creates conflict in regards to those programs. No, if Joe Biden wants to make private and public colleges and community colleges free, great, absolutely great. But how's it fair for you to make it for them free going forward, but not deal with the bills that people have gotten prior? You got to go both ways. That's my thought, Shane. That it doesn't matter if it's, the argument that these guys are making is irrelevant. 1 or 2% of the people that go to Princeton or Harvard or wherever else, who cares? I'm talking about the rest of the American public. And if it means paying off that 1 to 5%, so what? What are your thoughts, Shane?
I mean, part of the problem here, we could talk about the personal responsibility thing for just a second. For one thing, you were targeting President Biden as the main person who's accountable for making decisions. Personal responsibility is useful. As far as I can tell, people have had a hard time historically making arguments for collective accountability or collective responsibility. Usually that comes along with persecution. Usually personal responsibility, using that, saying you are personally responsible for this, it can actually be a pretty effective tactic if it's done widely, by a number of people who have each individually and as a group taken on personal responsibility to make that accusation, whatever. It's almost a philosophical argument, but it's a perfectly useful tactic. What you're saying is that your average American shouldn't, in some sense, and I agree with this, shouldn't have to take responsibility for making a bad decision that most of their society, pretty much everybody they were surrounded by, was recommending that they do. If you grew up in a generation where everybody's recommending that you go to college because that's the way to get ahead, I get what you're saying. You got a lot of pressure on you. It's ridiculous after the fact to say, okay, you shouldn't have done that. You should have stood up to everything that you were told and everything that you knew at the time, et cetera. That's not what I'm saying. At this point, I think we're in a different category. I think enough people have wised up to the fact that, like you said, Ted, in your essay, what was it? It's not college is a scam. What was it?
Something about college is a scam.
Was the title of it?
Something like that.
Something like that. Pretty close to that. Anyway, I think enough people have wised up to that at this point that there is a movement pushing back against it. I mean, whether it's people talking about going to trade schools or people talking about pursuing work outside of before they go to college instead of going to college, that kind of thing. In a weird way, this is almost an aside, but you can see this probably an aside. You can see this in Silicon Valley, where pretty much everybody, it became famous. Where like if you dropped out of Harvard, if you dropped out of Stanford or whatever, if you dropped out of one of these schools, you then went on to create a startup. Just as a sort of cultural, not moment, but a cultural pivot point around the idea of college, it became more prestigious to get out than it was to get in, which I think is an indictment of our education system, and admittedly still reserved for the privileged few who actually managed to drop out and then go on to found billion-dollar startups, whatever. But as a pivot point, I think that the conversation around this stuff has changed. And college is a scam. For the vast majority of people, it's a waste of your money. It may not be a waste of your time, but compared to how much money you're going to be on the hook for, it certainly becomes that. We've got a caller, though. I think we should go to him. We're taking more 202-521-1320. Michael, calling in from Sydney. Michael, you're on the line. What's going on?
Yeah. Look, first of all, I'd just like to make probably 2 points and then one quick point at the end. The first point is basically, I think there's an essay or a thesis in somebody who wants to write a a thesis on like disaster capitalism, the COVID capitalism or pandemic capitalism, bureaucratic control and political control, and corporate control. I really think there's an essay in that for someone there, a really good one too, from a libertarian perspective, and also from a socialist perspective. And the second point is, Jamarl, I've listened to a few points you've been talking about the Facebook ban over here in Australia and some of the opinion. I think you're suffering from a bit of cognitive dissonance. You yourself were rabbiting on, I'm not saying wrongly rabbiting on, but, putting your point forward about you being demonetized and deplatformed and everything like that. You actually create profit for YouTube as well through advertising and stuff like that. And YouTube advertises on your page or refuses to advertise on your page. And basically they're deplatforming media. I mean, I think goodbye to bad propaganda. I don't get Sputnik. I don't
well,
get,
Michael, just real quick, because I think you guys are missing where I'm coming from on this. It's not cognitive dissonance. I'm making the point that there is a difference between Facebook's point of view and the government's point of view. And Facebook's point of view, who's trying to basically just get profit, is looking at this and saying, how can we put pressure on the government to eliminate this rule? Now, they're a private company. Why wouldn't they think that way? Because that's my only point. From the standpoint of the Australian government, they're not wrong in going after Facebook for it either. But you just have this kind of this fight between the two sides. Like, am I really going to ignore and say Facebook doesn't have a point of view in this? They do. They're financial, they're profitable. They're a company. Of course they're going to do that. I give you a perfect example. In the United States, when AOC was going after Amazon, because Amazon wanted to put the company in New York, and they wanted to get all of these additional benefits. It was like they wanted New York to pay for the helipad and all of this other stuff. And AOC went after them for that. AOC should have went after them for that. The pressure that Amazon tends to use is, hey, look at how many jobs you're going to put. Look at this. But because the United States, all 50 states, don't have laws to prevent that race to the bottom, Amazon could basically gallivant around the United States to figure out where it's going to get the best option. I'm saying the same thing is taking place with Facebook right now. The only reason Facebook can do that to Australia is because other countries haven't necessarily put in rule sets that would prevent Facebook from putting that pressure on. Because if they did, they would just lose all ability to function. I'm making the distinction between what Facebook's point of view is and how they are looking for the maximization of profit, and how governments, their view is, and they're trying to get taxes off of these companies. It's not that I see either one as being wrong. I see either one as pushing for their side, if that makes sense. But go for it. Michael?
To demonetize you. It might be in their interest to say, all right, we're going to comply with government legislation and the will of the people, saying Jamarl Thomas is too left-wing, he's preaching anti-war, there's no money in that for the war machine, there's no money in that for Raytheon, there's no money in that for all these sponsors. We're going to demonetize him and take him off our platform because it's in our interest. And then something turns around to censorship on you. And just one last quick point about universities and useless degrees. Over here in Australia, we recently increased the courses on the fees on humanities, and they're saying basically they're not productive for society, but half the politicians in our country hold humanities degrees.
Thank you, Michael, for the call. Look, I don't think
I'm looking forward to that. I'd be like, okay, don't let the door hit you on your tuchus, Mr. Zuckerberg. So, it is interesting. I mean, certainly, they are a private company. They can act in their naked self-interest. But I don't know if, it's kind of like being the teacher who penalizes the entire class for the sins of one miscreant is really the best corporate politics. But I did want to push back on one important thing about the student loan issue. No rich kid takes out a student loan. If you're rich, why would you borrow money at 9 or 14 or 18% interest? You don't. Nobody does. The only people who take out student loans are, by definition, people who don't have enough money to pay their tuition and fees in college. So, I mean, you might say that it is true that some of these borrowers are better off than others, but no one rich is borrowing them. There's certainly middle class people who do, but we should just take that whole rich thing out of the equation because that just doesn't exist.
Good point. I hear you on that. So we got one more caller, barely time, but we'll try it. Caitlin, calling in from DC. You're on the line. What's on your mind? Caitlin, you there? We may not have Caitlin. That's to say. Ted, I want to thank you so much for sticking with us through this last segment. Great conversation. Really appreciate it.
a lot, guys.
And for those listening, that was Ted Rall. Closing him out. He's a political cartoonist, syndicated columnist, and graphic novelist. You can follow Ted on Twitter at Ted Rall. Also check out his cartoons and articles at rall.com. And we're closing this hour out. We'll be back with our last hour this morning on the other side of a short break and headlines. Stay tuned for those. Be right back in 1 minute.
Listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Fault lines.
Live from across the divided states of America, it is now time for the last hour of this morning's show. That's the most disruptive show in global news, events, and politics. In the independent corner, I am your political analyst, Shane Stranahan.
And in the left corner, I am the indefatigable, the ever-vigilant, the last man on the wall, your political analyst, Jamarl Thomas.
And together we are Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. This is an aside, and this could turn into its own conversation, so maybe it's a mistake to bring it up. But one thing we didn't talk about when we were talking about higher education in the last couple of segments is the fact that they do serve at this point. I mean, just look at what we were talking about with like woke culture, cancel culture, this kind of thing. Broadly, I'm in favor of people being treated fairly, like not even broadly, universally, I'm in favor of people being treated fairly. But colleges in the U.S. serve, and I will not hesitate to say this, as propaganda centers for producing people who broadly mess up our society and broadly use tactics to try to cancel people they don't like, and for doing things that, while you might blame them for it, are just things that normal people do, like being subtly racist or sexist or whatever. And they shouldn't. I agree. It would be good for them to learn. But there's like this all-out total war, Fabian warfare thing going on around the world, where it got to the point where last year, as we were talking about, France was complaining about the cultural export from American universities of like various schools of social science thought that are screwing their society up and are very clearly screwing our society up. And it basically leads to the suppression of speech in general by whatever the establishment power doesn't like. And that is how it works. Jamarl, that's its own long conversation. You're probably going to push back in some key ways, but what's your take?
And you think that's a college thing, not a person thing? No, I'm being serious.
I think it's
like when you're looking online. For a perfect example, forced to vote. People have a tendency to be tribal. I agree with you that liberal universities have that mindset. So I'm not necessarily going to entirely push back on that. There's a reality to that. But at the same time, people act tribal. Like, look at forced to vote. Look at what that became. I mean, I remember they were writing snake emoji lists. Like, I don't know if you saw that. That was listing of people and saying, okay, that guy wasn't for it. That guy wasn't for it. And these people are snakes. I'm just like, are you serious? And this was over just the tactic, and it ballooned into this kind of ridiculousness. I don't know if that's a college thing in and of itself, or if that's just a person thing.
I think the ideas and the motivation definitely came from a certain group of scholars in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, really the 70s and 80s, who were focusing on deeper ideas that there are fundamental inequalities in our society that are perpetuated by like institutions, by these things that you need to correct by changing how society views itself and how society talks. And that from there, on the internet, you've gotten a wave of people taking, in their eyes, direct action to try to remedy these problems. And in the process, that has led to McCarthyite-like purges. And those tactics have been imitated widely. You try to pick up the weapons that your opponent is using against you because that gives you staying power, and it's metastasized throughout society. But yes, I would say it came out of American colleges.
That work, basically. Look,
yes.
I would say this. A lot of the talk about identity politics right now are based probably in the 60s, where you had this kind of change in civil rights, where people were trying to push very hard for civil rights. And look, there are no clean wins. The moment that you start a particular movement for something, it's not like the movement just stops. Oftentimes you can get this kind of thing where it shifts, the pendulum goes too far in a particular direction. And sometimes that pendulum metastasizes into something else. I mean, think of the United States working with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. What did that become? Did that movement stop? Or did that movement become Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc.? I'm making the point that when we're talking about things and movements in our country, those movements don't always just stop. And sometimes you can get a situation where the benefit of it gets exceeded. I would argue Me Too, for example, was that way. It starts at a certain point. It is vital. It is necessary. It is crucial. And then it's even like weird, like men need contracts before they can have sex with women. Like, what? Clearly that's too far, right? And so I feel where you're coming from with it. And I do think on some level, colleges could be to blame for it. It depends on what you mean to blame for what. But I don't necessarily think that stuff starts and ends just in colleges. I do think this notion of civil rights, this notion of identity, this notion of fighting on this idea of being African American or Hispanic or whatever else, those things took hold. And they didn't just stop. They kept going and metastasized into other things. So I feel you.
There's definitely a confluence.
Yeah, there's a confluence.
I hear you. It definitely did not end in college. My argument is that it started there in American colleges, and I could do a little research project and figure out exactly which American colleges I would argue it started in, but we got headlines. I think we should get to them. In COVID news, at least 2,471 new coronavirus deaths and 70,142 new cases were reported in the U.S. yesterday. Over the past week, there's been an average of 77,661 cases per day. That's a decrease of 43% from the average 2 weeks earlier. And as of this morning, more than 27,873,000 people in the U.S. have been infected with the coronavirus, and over 490,000 have died from it. Life expectancy in the U.S. fell by a full year in the first half of 2020. That's a change that experts say was fueled by the growing coronavirus pandemic. According to the CDC, the life expectancy for the entire population dropped to 77.8 years. Black men, however, suffered the largest decline, with life expectancy dropping by 3 years between January and June of 2020. And Hispanic men saw a fall in life expectancy of 2.4 years during that period. Yesterday, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres sharply criticized the wildly uneven and unfair distribution of COVID-19 vaccines, saying 10 countries have administered 75% of all vaccinations, demanding a global effort to get all people in every nation vaccinated as soon as possible. The UN chief told a high-level meeting of the UN Security Council that 130 countries have not received a single dose of a COVID vaccine, and declared that at this critical moment, I'm quoting here, vaccine equity is the biggest moral test before the global community, end quote. Secretary General called on the world's major economic powers in the Group of 20 to establish an emergency task force to establish a plan and coordinate its implementation and financing. He said that task force should have the capacity, quote, to mobilize the pharmaceutical companies and key industry and logistics actors, end quote. Agreed, frankly. Applications for asylum in the European Union dropped by more than 30% in 2020 compared to the previous year, reaching their lowest level since 2013. The European Asylum Support Office said today that a decrease of 31% in the 27 member states, plus Norway and Switzerland, is mainly the result of emergency travel restrictions put in place during the coronavirus pandemic. In national political news, many Texans woke up to another day of a power crisis and issues with water systems due to a historic winter storm that brought record freezing temps in the state. Residents were under notices to boil tap water before drinking it after days of record low temperatures damaged infrastructure and froze water pipes in at least 2 hospitals in the city of Austin, Texas. They were left without water and heat on Tuesday night, forcing patients and staff to transport human waste in trash bags and refrain from showering or even washing their hands. This is yesterday, Tesla CEO Elon Musk slammed the Texas electrical grid operator for being unreliable after millions of residents were left without power. Former President Donald Trump joined Hannity on Wednesday night to remember conservative radio host Rush Limbaugh, who died at age 70 after a long battle with lung cancer. Trump reflected on his decision to award Limbaugh the Presidential Medal of Freedom during the State of the Union address last February, this just days after the conservative icon had announced his stage 4 lung cancer diagnosis. In international news, yesterday, senior journalist Priya Ramani was acquitted in a Delhi court of the criminal defamation charge that former federal minister Mubashir Jawad Akbar brought against her because of the Me Too sexual harassment allegation she submitted 2 years ago. Ramani had alleged that the former Minister of State for External Affairs had sexually harassed her during a job interview in 1994. The judgment on the case that brought her acquittal said, quote, "Sexual abuse takes away dignity and self-confidence. Right of reputation can't be protected at the cost of the right to dignity. The time has come for our society to understand that sometimes a victim may not speak for years because of the mental trauma. The woman cannot be punished for raising her voice against sexual abuse," end quote. In Spain, 29 people have been detained across the Catalonia region due to protests over the arrest of rapper Pablo Hasél, who was convicted for, quote, "slander against the crown," end quote, concerning his provocative song lyrics and social media posts. Many of the big cities in Spain are participating. In Madrid, police resorted to tear gas and rubber bullets to disperse the protesters. The demonstration began on Wednesday evening in the central square of the capital, Puerta del Sol, where citizens gathered in support of freedom of speech. Protesters demanded the immediate release of rapper Pablo Hasél, who was sentenced to 9 months in prison for glorifying terrorism and insulting the nation's monarchy. In Japan, Olympics Minister Seiki Hashimoto had today resigned from her cabinet position in order to head the organizing committee for this year's Olympic Games. This follows the resignation of Yoshiro Mori, who had faced calls to step down after he said in closed-door talks that women talk too much, made a couple other sexist comments too. The Olympic Games are scheduled to take place between July 23rd and August 8th later this year. In tech news, in response to a proposed law forcing the tech giant to share revenue with media outlets, Facebook removed posts of Australian news outlets and government pages, including those belonging to the Meteorology Bureau, the Pandemic Response, Mental Health, and Emergency Services. This came after the proposed media bargaining law passed the lower house yesterday. In response, Josh Friedenberg has stated, quote, "In respect to Facebook's actions today, Facebook was wrong," end quote. He noted that the blockage of Australians' access to government pages was completely unrelated, I'm quoting here, to the media code, which is yet to pass through the Senate. He added, "But what today's events do confirm for all Australians is the immense market power of these media digital giants." In our next headline, Vladimir Tenevs, co-CEO of the online broker Robinhood, will appear before the House Financial Services Committee today and defend his company's decision in late January to temporarily restrict trading in several stocks, including GameStop Inc. He is also pushing back against allegations that the app's features encourage investors to buy and sell stocks too frequently or invest in risky options trading. He states, quote, "Any allegation that Robinhood acted to help hedge funds or other special interests to the detriment of our customers is absolutely false and market-distorting rhetoric," end quote. The country of Egypt plans to build its first high-speed train line, which would connect the Red Sea to the Mediterranean. The route would stretch across approximately 1,000 kilometers. It's about 620 miles, and is planned to have 15 stops along the way. On January 14th, Egypt's National Authority for Tunnels signed a memorandum of understanding with Egyptian firms Orascom Construction and Arab contractors, as well as with Germany's Siemens Mobility, to design and build the high-speed rail system. The companies will reportedly be paid $23 billion American dollars for building and maintenance of the entire network over 15 years. Each line is planned to be implemented within 2 years. The first is scheduled to be completed in 2023, would cost about $3 billion. In Earth and Science news, a NASA rover streaked toward a landing on Mars on Thursday in the riskiest step yet in an epic quest to bring back rocks that could answer whether life ever existed on the red planet. Ground controllers at the space agency's Jet Propulsion Laboratory, I've hung out there many times, in Pasadena, California, settled in nervously for the descent of Perseverance to the surface of Mars, along a death trap for incoming spacecraft. It takes a nail-biting 11 and a half minutes for a signal that would confirm success to reach Earth. The landing of the six-wheeled vehicle would mark the third visit to Mars in just over a week. This is after 2 spacecraft from the UAE, United Arab Emirates, and China swung into orbit around the planet on successive days last week. In business news, U.S. headquartered e-commerce giant Amazon has found itself roped into controversies in India after it was revealed that it had been favoring a handful of sellers and manipulating government guidelines between 2012 and 2019. The online shopping platform has been accused of giving preferential treatment to a total of 35 Indian merchants who reportedly had 2/3 of Amazon's online sales out of over 400,000 sellers. Last year, Amazon CEO Jeff Bezos announced a $1 billion investment to digitally empower small and medium businesses in India. Amazon's Small and Medium Business Impact Report 2020 claimed that the platform works with over a million of these small companies in India that include sellers, enterprises, and delivery partners. And one of the world's largest video game makers, Epic Games, has filed a formal antitrust complaint against Apple to the European Commission, claiming the Silicon Valley giant imposes unviable burdens on rivals. Epic Games founder and chief executive Tim Sweeney said, quote, the 30% they charge as their app tax, they can make it 50% or 90% or 100%. Under their theory of how these markets are structured, they have every right to do that. Epic is not asking any court or regulator to change this 30% to some other number, only to restore competition on iOS, end quote. iOS, again, is Apple's mobile operating system. The two companies have been locked in a legal battle since August after the game maker tried to sidestep the fee by implementing its own in-app payments. Apple has maintained that its rules apply equally to all developers and that Epic violated them. And with that, those are our headlines. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but we'll be back in a minute on the other side of this break with our next guest, Scott Ritter. Be right back.
Fault Lines. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. We give you the most essential information out there. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Feeling kind of blue, but maybe also kind of red, and kind of purple, and kind of alone? You've got a friend on Radio Sputnik. Tune into Political Misfits from 12 to 2 Eastern Time, Monday through Friday, for news, politics, and culture without the two-party bias. Catch us daily on 105.5 in Washington, D.C., or 102.9 or 104.7 in Kansas City. Or find us on Twitter, Facebook, YouTube, Spotify, or wherever you get your news.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. If you guys live in the area, you can catch us on radio at 105.5 FM and 1390 AM. We're also in Kansas City at 102.9 FM and 104.7 FM. If you guys are digging what Shane and I are putting down, whatever platform you're consuming this content on, give us a like and share that audio or video. You can also join in the conversation with a chat, a tweet, and of course, you can reach us by phone at 202-521-1320. That is 202-521-1320. Your engagement helps make the show what it is, so definitely don't be shy. So, an interesting case came about. On Tuesday morning, the D.C. court sided with the CIA in a dispute involving the FOIA requests, Freedom of Information Act requests, from Buzzfeed to the CIA, stemming from a Trump tweet. Now, what this boils down to is that, if you remember, Trump put out a tweet that was talking about the money that the CIA was basically, or the Obama administration was putting into overturning the Syrian government. If you also remember, the New York Times came out with a story when Donald Trump ended that program, saying that basically Obama spent $1 billion or more trying to depose Assad. This goes to the whole there are no boots on the ground stuff. If you remember also, Fox News reported about the money that was going into terrorist hands in Syria. Tulsi Gabbard brought this up on a news show with Jake Tapper, where Jake Tapper recoiled, saying the government says it's not doing that. Clearly, the government was doing that. And BuzzFeed was in a case trying to get information on the terrorists that the U.S. government was supporting. Well, BuzzFeed winning the case at one point, losing the case at the very end. So right here, because the president's tweet makes it implausible for any basically one judge agreed with this, basically saying, look, Donald Trump put this tweet out, which means it lets the cat out of the bag. We were doing this. Ergo, the FOIA request should go through. This was appealed. The CIA appealed to the D.C. Circuit, which reversed the lower court and slapped away BuzzFeed's suit on Tuesday. Randolph concluded that the tweet was was not an official acknowledgement of the existence of agency records. basically, Buzzfeed was shot down in trying to get information about the program where we were giving all of this money to terrorists in Syria. To discuss, we're joined by UN, or former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower, Scott Ritter. Scott, welcome to the show. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Absolutely. When this story came out, you were one of the first people we thought of, being one of the former UN weapons inspectors. What do you think about this? I mean, if I'm being honest, Donald Trump's tweet does let the cat out of the bag. The New York Times does let the cat out of the bag with their episode talking about the $1 billion spent. Trump himself lets the cat out of the bag when he gives that speech talking about the 500,000 people that died as a result of our intrusion into Syria to try to depose Assad. Is the court wrong in this ruling?
Well, I mean, that will be that's a legal question. One thing we can say for certainty about U.S. law is that it's very malleable.
Yes.
And so,
yes, it is. Well, and subjective in many respects. That's why they fight so hard over the Supreme Court. I guess what I'm getting at is any reasonable person knows that we were putting money, billions of dollars, to depose Assad at this point. It has been publicized all over the place. So the idea that they were turned down a FOIA request on this, it just seems wrong on its face, considering the reality of events.
No, of course. I will say one thing, though. The CIA's actions, whether you agree with them or disagree with them, the fact of the matter is we have a Central Intelligence Agency that carries out covert activities on behalf of the United States government. And the whole concept of covert activity is that it doesn't get publicized. And so, what we have here is an organization, Buzzfeed, trying to exploit, President Trump's inauspicious tweet. I'm not blaming Buzzfeed. If I were in Buzzfeed's place, I'd be doing the same thing. But it's, the president created what is being interpreted as a loophole, an error in the way that official government records are deemed official and protected, and they're trying to exploit that. And I think the court is stepping in and shutting that down because, frankly speaking, while I believe in transparency, I'm not one that is a big fan of the CIA. But if you're in the government, you protect your secrets, and this is the government protecting government secrets. The courts have almost always sided on behalf of the CIA when it comes to protecting its operations, its sources, etc. And that's what I think is happening here. Is it right? No, but it is what it is. I mean, this is just the reality of the U.S. government. They're not going to allow a news organization to exploit a presidential error to gain access to information that hasn't been properly declassified.
And at the end of the day, I don't think a lot of folks, like you're saying, I don't think a lot of folks are going to be surprised about this. You aren't, we aren't, et cetera. What's interesting to me here, though, is that the district judge who ruled on this, Contreras, basically said there's enough to go on. Any reasonable person looking at Trump's tweet sees that there would be more data. There would be more records. The CIA would have stuff that they haven't released. And so any reasonable person would assume that. Then the circuit court, when they ruled on this, basically said that an assumption isn't enough. But that's the thing. I mean, if you're doing a FOIA, if you're trying to get information out there, isn't it based on the assumption that there isn't that all you can ever go on? In other words, wouldn't this shut down the very nature? Wouldn't it sort of cut to the core of what a FOIA request is? Am I wrong in that, Scott? Like if you can't, any person who's submitting a FOIA request is assuming that there is information in there. That's what you have to go on because you don't have the records themselves. What am I missing here?
No, I mean, you're not. You're absolutely right. It is a judicial decision that could be used to, I believe, make it more difficult for FOIA requests to go forward. Because you're right, for a FOIA request to have merit, you're not allowed to go into a fishing expedition. You're not allowed to just go in there and just willy-nilly request things based upon a hunch or an assumption. You need to be very specific about the document you're searching for, the information you're searching for, and the belief that you have that the government would have that record. And so here we have, common sense apparently doesn't apply. And now you have a judicial opinion that, the government lawyers who are very effective at blocking FOIA requests. So government lawyers will now be able to fall back on this, I believe, and make it even more difficult for information to be forthcoming through the FOIA process.
It seemed like a horrible ruling. I mean, because honestly, the moment that Trump gets up and admits, yes, we were doing this, the moment that Tulsi Gabbard, Congressman, gets on television and admits we're doing this, the moment that it comes out in the New York Times that we're doing this, it seems beyond just a belief. At that point, it's flat fact reality that has been put out into the media space. Like, it just seems that the judge was taken up to position to overtly defend the CIA in a situation where the information was available and the information was known. I'm making the point that it's not a guess. It's not a leap of logic. That it is dead set even. Like, it's a real world thing at that point. That's my only issue with this. It seems that this is a cover-up. And it seems that the cover-up was done explicitly to protect government and what the government was doing. That is not the judge's job. That's all I think we're getting at, is that the judge took a provocative action in order to defend the CIA. And look, I agree with you. Government wants to protect their secrets. By the same token, Buzzfeed is not wrong for pushing. And more importantly, the public itself needs to know. How can the public hold the government accountable if the government or the public doesn't know what the government is doing? I mean, that just seems to be a fundamental problem in regards to the American public keeping track of what their government and the responses of their government. You know this better than others. I mean, you were a WMD whistleblower. You were the UN weapons inspector. Isn't that to some degree very similar? People are trying to get information out to the American public so the public can make a decision on foreign policy and the leadership for that foreign policy. And you were one of the people that were given the whistleblowing saying, hey, something is wrong with this picture. We need to get that information out. Isn't there a similarity in these things?
Well, I mean, I have to say this. My efforts as a former UN weapons inspector actually allowed me to operate outside of U.S. government restrictions. U.S. government tried their best to stop me from speaking out officially. The Department of Defense did everything they could to stop me from publishing a book, et cetera. But we successfully, mounted a counterattack and basically said U.S. government doesn't control anything I did as a UN weapons inspector. End of story. Full stop. Period. And then the CIA actually had to come out and acknowledge when I was charged with espionage by the FBI, and there was an effort to put me away for life. For the work I was doing as a UN weapons inspector, the CIA basically had to come out and say any information shared with the United Nations was declassified at the time that it was shared with the United Nations. So, legally speaking, anything Mr. Ritter speaks about as a UN weapons inspector that was gained from the U.S. is unclassified. So I was very fortunate in that area from a legal standpoint. Now, I used to be a military intelligence officer, and I signed a number of non-disclosure agreements regarding, my work and the information that I gained access to, and I have never violated those non-disclosure agreements, and nor would I. So I've not run up against some of the problems that U.S. government officials run into, former government officials, when they try to talk about these things. You speak of the corruption of the courts. I think if you go into the, there's two former CIA officers that ran afoul of the U.S. government when it came to, the handling of classified information, or what the government claimed to be mishandling. John Kirikow and I think Jeff Sterling were both put in prison for this. But if you go and take a look at the history of their trial, you will see that the CIA interceded with the judge, the kind of thing that normally wouldn't be allowed. because everything's supposed to be out in the open. They had secret meetings with the judge where the judge was briefed on information on the U.S. government position and why things should remain secret. This kind of ex parte meeting isn't supposed to occur. It's unconstitutional. It's illegal. But it happens all the time when we're dealing with the CIA and the U.S. government protecting, state secrets. And this is a case where this information was necessary for the successful defense of these two litigants, and the CIA interceded to keep it out of the trial, thereby manufacturing a false narrative that was used to convict. It's wrong. It's not just about information. We're talking about people's liberty here. Anybody who thinks that the U.S. judicial system is incapable of being corrupted by government interference just doesn't know the U.S. justice system.
They couldn't be more wrong. And I mean, we've got to close this segment. We'll bring you back in a minute on the other side to get into another conversation. But part of the deal here is BuzzFeed submitted that FOIA request. They wanted to get a scoop on this, clearly. If they had published what they got, if they ever received it, I'm guessing some of what they would have been publishing, some of what they would have received, would have shown something that no American would like, which is that the United States, more evidence that the United States was backing ISIS and Al-Qaeda affiliates at the very same time as we were still engaged in a war against Al-Qaeda in a close by country. And at the same time as, 2013, 14, 15, ISIS was starting to grow. In America, the perception was ISIS is our foremost foe globally. And if we found out that, and even with even more evidence that we were backing them, I don't think that would go across well. So it's one thing for the intelligence services of our country to protect their covert operations in the best interest of Americans, but I don't think any American, if they were to look at this, would feel that the CIA was acting in their best interest. Anyway, we need to go into a break. We are joined by Scott Ritter. For those listening, he is a former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower who you can follow on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We will be back with Scott on the other side of this short break.
Fault Lines. Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Are you bored? Are you lonely? Do you need a hug? Well, we can't give you that, but we can keep you up to date on Radio Sputnik.
Fault Lines.
Welcome back to Fault Lines on Radio Sputnik. My name is Jamarl Thomas. I'm joined by my co-host Shane Stranahan, coming to you live out of our station in Washington, D.C. We're going to continue our conversation with Scott Ritter. In the last instance, or the last segment, we had a conversation about basically a court case by Buzzfeed, where Buzzfeed was not allowed to get its hands on records, even though it was very clear that the records they wanted to get their hands on in the FOIA requests, at the very least, information had been put out into the public to get across what they wanted. They wanted information on the U.S. support for terrorists in Syria. The court initially agreed, but later, at the very end, the court sided with the CIA, basically saying that information was not going to be disclosed. In addition to this, another issue has come up with Joe Biden. Now, Joe Biden has basically created a China task force. It was a Pentagon-run China task force, the goal being to review how the military is postured to deter China in the Pacific region. This goes into the whole thing, or the history that we have in this country of ballooning threats and acting as if those threats are larger than what those threats are. In one case, we had the missile gap, the famous, or probably the most famous, where we were acting as if there was a missile parity, or, for that matter, a missile gap, that the Soviet Union had an advantage over the United States in the number of missiles. Kennedy pushed this, even attacking Eisenhower on this point, saying, we have a missile gap, when Kennedy knew that the missile gap wasn't there. Something similar is happening with the United States and China, where there's this kind of inflated idea of a threat of China, when really China forces are gathered basically to defend its mainland, not for external aggression. To continue this conversation, we have again Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. Scott, again, welcome to the show, man. Thank you for joining us. China. It sounds a lot like the missile threat with the Soviet Union. It's like, oh, there's a missile gap. There's a missile gap. We need more money for the military. We need more money for the military. When the reality of it is, China's posture is more towards defense of the homeland and the surrounding regions of that homeland, not in this kind of foreign adventurism that we're involved in, that we are acting as if China is involved in order to increase the amount of money we're spending on our military. Can you discuss that? I mean, is the article correct? Is China indeed, is this really the United States looking for another enemy to justify the amount of money that they're spending, since spending $1 trillion to hunt people down in caves is not as believable? What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, there was a book written by a former CIA officer back in the 70s. He worked in Vietnam, and he went to Africa, called In Search of Enemies. And that title of that book pretty much defines the United States, in the, not only during the Cold War, but in the post-Cold War era. We're in search of enemies to justify our existence. The United States emerged from the Second World War as the global, is a dominant superpower. And we use that position to impose what we call the rules-based order on the world. The rules, of course, being the rules that we wrote and we are compelling everybody to abide by. And these rules cover every aspect of international interaction, financial, travel, military, diplomatic, you name it. We've written the rules for it. The World Health Organization, the trade organizations, everything are all working off of a rule book that we wrote. And today we have a situation where the situation no longer exists, where these rules are apply, and there need to be new rules made. Let's take China and its economic prominence. China is no longer a third world or developing nation. It's a global economic superpower that's outmatching the United States every which way you look. They signed the world's largest free trade agreement in the Pacific that locked the United States out. They just concluded a free trade agreement with the European Union that the United States opposed. It locks the United States out. And the U.S. is struggling to, deal with China. We don't know how to handle the Bridges and Roads Initiative, the new Silk Road that China is building both over land, going across Central Asia into Europe, then the Water Silk Road coming down through the Indo-Pacific up through, into Africa and into Europe that way. We don't know how to deal with it except with the one tool we have, which is the military. And so we need, the problem with U.S.-China relations is economic, that China's outclassing us every which way economically. And we don't know how to, come up with a counter. So we're seeking to redefine the Chinese problem as a military problem. And here we have a problem. We spent the last 20 years pouring trillions of dollars into becoming specialists in kicking down village doors and terrorizing Afghan and Iraqi civilians, or putting missiles into wedding parties, or doing any number of things. I mean, and sometimes we kill bad guys, quote unquote bad guys, but we spend $1 billion to knock out, one terrorist in the hills of Pakistan or Afghanistan. But we forgot how to wage conventional war. We forgot how to do combined arms operations on the ground. And we've allowed our Navy to get used to operating in a permissive environment where there is no threat, where aircraft carriers can just drill holes in the sea, launch airplanes without opposition, bomb any target they want, and return unopposed. And now we're saying, well, how do we confront China? And we have to deal with the reality that China, this defensive nation, that is, yes, being very aggressive in pushing economic power, but not military power. But they've built a very effective defense that has been focused on how do you counter America's naval supremacy? Well, you build missiles capable of sinking American aircraft carriers before they can get close to your shore. This is a reality that we have to deal with, that our military is configured in a manner that cannot deal with China. And this is what the United States is doing, is seeking to reconfigure the military so that it can, take on China in places like the South China Sea. Again, I'm not saying I support what China's doing, but it's not an existential threat to the United States. It's an issue that should be resolved diplomatically. And frankly speaking, if left to its own devices, will be resolved peacefully, because the nations of the region recognize that, you're better off dealing with the Chinese economically. You will flourish than trying to confront them militarily over a bunch of, coral atolls in the middle of the South China Sea. But we're making it an existential issue, and we're seeking to gear our military, at great expense, by the way, to be able to confront China militarily in areas like the South China Sea. How do we interdict them in Africa? If they seek to, follow up their economic power expansion with military power. So this is what's going on. We're in search of an enemy. We've defined that enemy as China. We recognize that our military is incapable of dealing with this threat that we have manufactured, not a threat that exists. And we're going to spend hundreds of billions of dollars, crafting a tool to meet a non-existent threat.
And that's why the most fundamental problem that America faces, in my opinion, is our military-industrial complex. We as a nation are geared, our diplomatic, our internal domestic policy is geared towards fulfilling the demands that our foreign policy places on the rest of our economy. And whether you're looking at the trillions of dollars that we spend on our military, or you're looking at the long-term crises where for years, lifespan has dropped more quickly in early 2020 than it had in previous years. But nevertheless, for a string of years now, lifespan in the United States have dropped. And yes, that has to do with the economy. That has to do with the poor provision of healthcare. There are all different ways in which you can analyze what's actually at fault here. But in my opinion, the deeper underlying problem is that we are so committed, we have become so overextended in trying to maintain, like you said, our order, our international order, the institutions that we built up, that we can't re-gear, pivot towards some other more positive scenario when it comes to engaging with other nations. And of course, the concern here is that we, by trying to maintain that power at every step, are going to, at some point, and hopefully not soon, start to push other countries into action, which is what it would be. Again, Russia, China, our main international geopolitical quote-unquote foes, are pretty defensive. They're pretty much trying to maintain their territories, whereas we are trying to maintain our power up to and past the edges of their territories. And of course, the concern is when they're on the defense and we're trying to maintain our offense, we're going to overstep our boundaries at a certain point, and that could turn into some cataclysmic new world war. I want to come back to you on this, Scott. It seems to me, and I want to come back to basically the first thing that I said, because I might be wrong about this, and I want to hear your take as somebody with a lot of experience in this category. It seems that the long-run wage stagnation, the decades-long economic problems that we have and that we still have not fully addressed, even after in this past year, major economic crisis that we managed to paper over and push back, it seems like there's going to be a reckoning there. And it seems like to me, our military commitments overseas and at home are the fundamental problem with that. Am I wrong in that? What's your take, Scott?
No, you're absolutely correct. Look, I'm a big believer in national defense. I believe in a strong country. But I think you got to look at fundamentals. For a nation to be strong, we need an educated nation. So one of our top priorities has to be education. We need a healthy nation. So we need, a nation that has, not just an adequate healthcare system, but, because you wouldn't just say we need an adequate military. No, we need the best military there is. And I would say we don't need an adequate healthcare system. We need the best healthcare system in the world. We don't have it. We need a nation that functions properly. That means infrastructure. We have crumbling infrastructure. The fourth pillar of national security is the military. It's the lowest on the priority list. You only talk about funding the military after you've taken care of education, healthcare, and infrastructure. But we flipped it the other way around. We're pouring every significant resource into our military, our research and development, our brain trust, our industrial base is all focused on the military. I know people that work in, mundane industries, plastics industries. They don't make their money off of servicing civilian contractors. I mean, they make some money, but they're all looking for that military contract because that's where the money is. And that's just a sad reality that our economy is so dependent upon, military-related funding. We've got it backwards. So yes, you're absolutely correct. Our focus on the military has led to our nation ignoring what really makes a nation great. The greatness of a nation cannot be measured by its military. The greatness of a nation is measured by the education of its people, the health of its people, and the quality of its infrastructure. And once you have that, you have something worth defending, and then you build a military capable of defending that. But we've put it the other way around, and this is why our country is, crumbling as we speak, because we're putting all our effort into building this military and no effort into building a great nation.
And Scott, what's sad to me, but also ironic, is that the very international rules-based order that we're trying to protect, one based on principles of free trade and liberalism and democracy abroad, we seem to be opposing at home. And you can see this most clearly in our relations with China. We have turned away from it. What was a positive sum vision of the world, where they produced goods, we produced goods, we traded, everybody benefited because you had some, a division of labor internationally. We have turned our back on that at the moment when they seem to be ready to reach the point where they, resume their status as a major world power. And, so in a weird way, we already betrayed the vision. We already turned our back on those institutions when we turned to realpolitik on this issue and when we started to view it in terms of a purely negative sum military game. But we're out of time here. Scott, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
For those listening, that was Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector and WMD whistleblower. Again, you can follow Scott on Twitter at @RealScottRitter. And you're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. We're going into a break, but on the other side of this break, we're taking your calls. We're going into our rap segment. The phone number is 202-521-1320. See you again in just a minute.
Fault Lines.
Shooting from the lip.
We're taking no prisoners here. Real opinions for real people. Where we bring you people with controversial views, and instead of trying to catch them out, we actually let them expand on their views. What's going on in British politics, European politics, and indeed in world politics as well. And wherever you are, whether you're a UKIP supporter, a Tory or Labour, everything is in turmoil.
John Gaunt.
Shooting from the lip.
Fault Lines.
And we're back. You're listening to Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan. And we're now in our rap segment, closing out today's show. That means we're taking your calls more than ever. 202-521-1320. Again, that phone number is 202-521-1320. Jamarl, I saw you posting this link in the chat just now. Let's go to this real quick. 2 journalists jailed for 2 years in Belarus for filming protests. The Belarusian government accusing them of orchestrating the protests that they were filming. They were filming protests following the death of a protester taking place to protest that death. This, of course, part of a wider wave of public opposition to the election in which Lukashenko, president, head of state of Belarus, was reelected again for I don't even know how many times at this point it's been, but in power for almost 3 decades at this point, known as the last dictator in Europe. Now the West, they've been pushing Tikhanovskaya, the sort of main opposition candidate who's presented herself as an alternative to Lukashenko. In my opinion, that's fraught. She wouldn't have the support at home, but frankly, it's not my business. It's not necessarily Europe's business. It's Belarus's business for them to work this stuff out for themselves. Having said that, though, the jailing of these 2 protesters, the jailing of these 2 people who are filming that stuff, that seems ridiculous to me. It doesn't seem like that they deserve that. What's your take?
Massively beyond the pale. Massively beyond the pale. I mean, they're basically putting journalists in prison for doing journalism. And, we would have problems with that if that was in the United States. We would have problems with that if that was anywhere. Look, I think it's vitally important, like we told Scott. How do you control a government? if you don't know what it's doing. And the entire point of legitimacy that's leveled on the government, the legitimacy to some degree came because they won the votes and also because they're receptive to the public itself. How do you know that stuff without having journalists to do the job? And so it's like, well, whether we're complaining about Assange, whether we're complaining about the media not being earnest with the American public in regards to the things that we do abroad, or whether we're looking at this, it's problematic, to put it mildly. That's what I think about it. I don't think we should be putting journalists in prison for doing journalism.
Agreed. All right. You know what? We're taking calls 202-521-1320. We've got Tarif calling in from New Orleans. Tarif, you're on the line. What's going on?
Free Julian Assange. I'd like to say, first of all, I'm also a whistleblower, Google whistleblower Terry Simon. Okay, the Enron thing back in the 90s, the thing with this Texas it came from deregulation, dealing with the energy sector. They only built so many plants in Texas where they put profit over putting money into new technologies like coal, clean coal, and nuclear power, gas, whatnot. And Enron, instead of taking that money and investing in new plants, they basically pocketed. So when those windmills started failing and they transferred a load of energy to the nuclear power and the coal plants, the natural gas plants, they started going offline because the safety switches on them were set at a certain level, and some of the safety switches also frozen. They couldn't handle that power surge because they only had just-in-time, what you call it, just-in-time energy. It's like just-in-time delivery service dealing with the food market or whatever. So they didn't have redundancy, and that's why that system failed, because the money went into the stock market instead into new plants. You see what I'm saying? So now people seeing what's going on, but the new Bloomberg reports is not reporting on that. So, the way you can overcome this is by building new plants, new gas plants, coal plants, and new nuclear power to supplement the windmills and the solar panels when they starting to fail. But you got to work all together. Yeah, that's all I want to say today.
Reef, thank you for the call. I mean, you brought up the wind turbines the other day. I'll be honest, when I looked into this stuff, the wind turbines are a small fraction of what's actually going on there. You also brought up natural gas plants. It seems like the largest part of the problem is that the natural gas extraction facilities didn't have proper insulation. They couldn't deal with extreme cold. Now, admittedly, unprecedented cold, record setting. However, they should have been prepared for that kind of thing because, like you're saying, this is critical infrastructure. This is you prepare for those long tail, unlikely events, even though it costs you a bit more money, even though all that stuff is true, because in the event that something like this happens, you want to be prepared for it. You want to be able to weather that storm, come out the other side, keep people alive, all this stuff. This says, what is it right now? Austin, Texas, temperature, literally looking this up, 28 degrees, so below freezing. I've lived in Austin before. 28 degrees is pretty cold for Austin. Still winter, but that's a serious problem going on there. What was it? Last count, 5 million houses without power. Huge numbers here. And again, because their infrastructure setup wasn't built to handle it. Now, is Elon Musk going to ride in on his metallic horse, his Tesla horse, and save the day? I don't think so. I think he's just lamenting the state of this when he's complaining about the electric power grid. But Jamarl, you have to go along with me in asking the question: is he going to try to do something about it, or is he just
He's just going to complain? I don't even know what he could do about it. I mean, this seems like an issue of state, not necessarily an issue of the private individual. And I got to be honest, I wouldn't want this to be an issue for a private individual. I would rather this be an issue that we handle as a collective. Texas shouldn't be this way. I mean, I understand that, it's record temperatures and everything else, but 90% of the things that failed, the plants that failed, were either oil, gas, or some kind of, it wasn't the windmills. The windmills make up a very small portion of Texas. Oil, gas, or coal plants. And, the idea that these guys were pushing that the Green New Deal that has never been passed, never been implemented, let alone, definitely not in Texas, was somehow responsible for this is utter lunacy. If you want to point to anything, point to, the climate change. I mean, point to the storms getting worse. Point to the things that we're putting in the air and the atmosphere, making it worse. Saudi Arabia has a snowstorm right now. Have you seen that? There are images of camels shocked and confused by what is taking place. Cuomo should be shocked and confused. We as people should be shocked and confused. And yeah, this excuse that these guys came up with just makes the situation worse. So that's what I think. Texas shouldn't be that way. We should have invested far more energy into energy production, resources in energy production, maintenance of that energy production. We know that there are going to be storms. We know that there are going to be things to try to knock out the power. And it looks like due diligence would have been given to thinking through how we would make that work where it wouldn't be a situation. So, I get that this is not necessarily something that Texas planned for, but the question is, should they have planned for it? And I think the answer is yes. Inevitably, bad weather will happen. And now you have a situation with 5 million people out of power. I showed the pictures and the images of these guys just getting buckets of water because they don't have any for themselves because their pipes froze. And people, at a time where they need electricity, don't have it. When I was at home several years ago, I was doing treatments at home. I had the machine and everything. I learned how to cannulate or stick myself with a needle the size of an ink pen. And for 4 or 5 hours a night, I would do treatments. What happens with all of those patients at home now? How do they get treatments? How do they get the breathing machines? How do they get, all of these things are vital services that people need in order to just live. And those are things that basically they no longer have. So yeah, it's our responsibility to get that stuff. And no, that responsibility was not lived up to. Nancy, Florida. What's going on, Nancy? How you doing?
Hi guys. Yeah, I'm calling to talk about about Trump some more. About talking about how we tried to impeach him and the reason I talk about that is because I think that the impeachment really missed the point of all those people in D.C. that day, because I don't know how many people got into the Capitol. But I really couldn't find any exact numbers of how many people actually showed up at D.C. that day. But I heard 10,000 and some as high as 100,000. And so, I think that by blaming it all on Trump and making it all about Trump, I think that we're really missing the bigger point here is that, as somebody put in the chat, the plebs are angry. And I think that, the things we talk about every day, kind of in passing on, they're just the root of the problems. All the protests over the summer, sure, they've been, flared. They may have been triggered by the George Floyd, but people are angry. The people who are in charge, supposedly the Ivy League educated best in the country, are just grossly incompetent. They just don't care, and so what to think. And the voting doesn't matter. We've seen you vote Medicare for all. Most of the people in the country want us to forgive these student debts, and the people in charge pretend like we don't want that, and they say that. Well, the American people don't want this. The American people, they're not talking for us. They're talking for, I guess, their corporate overlords. So the people knocking at the door, maybe and for Shane to think that there wasn't a age of provocateurs in that group. Our intelligence agency, from his back 50 years, they're masters at that. So I think they really took something that they saw was going to happen and made it work for them. And now they're closing their ranks. The establishment is closing their ranks and passing all kinds of laws that are going to shut down all kinds of dissent. And there's a lot of dissent out there because they've been fomenting it for years. So I
agreed with you on a lot of that, but Nancy, you just said yourself, people are angry. I mean, I don't think I was the only one to say that there weren't age of provocateurs. I think Jamarl also said that, but whatever. Like you just said, people are angry. I don't think that just because people are angry, we should start calling them domestic terrorists, which it seems like our administration is getting ready to do if we haven't already done it. And you're right, whether it's the Black Lives Matter protest, what happened on January 6th, or just the wave of support, even back in the day, back in 2008, the people who supported Obama had some of that anger too. They were frustrated with the way things were going in the country. Those frustrations were not alleviated by the financial crisis and what we did to deal with it. Just giving hedge funds and billionaires more money. But a lot of the same people went to support Trump. A lot of that same energy you saw expressed through Trump's victory back in 2016, even more strongly. It's all an expression of that same anger. And our response to it apparently is to call people who are angry again, get ready to call them domestic terrorists. It seems where we are. I don't know, Jamarl, what's your take?
I agree with you. I mean, look, I don't think we can say they were Asian provocateurs if we can't point out the Asian provocateurs. That's easy to say. People were angry. They were very upset. And I think that's all you needed as a precipice for those people to raid the Capitol. So, yeah, I agree with you, Shane.
All right, we got to close this out. I want to thank everybody for calling in. I want to thank our guests. Good interviews, good conversations with Dr. Kogan, Ted Rall, Scott Ritter, KJ No. Thank you, Jamarl. Jamarl Thomas, my co-host, for co-hosting the show with me. Thank you, engineer Andre. Thank you, producers Cameron and Raheem. And thank you, that is you, for listening to this show. We will be back tomorrow, folks, signing off. Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan.
Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan, another one in the record books. Guys, I want to thank you all for joining us once again. The channel is back up. I am happy that your channel is back up. And you guys can watch. Look, I'm going to end this here. You guys are probably going to see me throughout the course of the day. It is nasty out. And apparently they're expecting some kind of ice or snowstorm or something here again in Washington, in Maryland. But look, thank you all for joining us. Absolutely appreciate it. Definitely hit the like. Definitely hit the share. Make sure you are subscribed. And this is Fault Lines with Thomas and Stranahan signing off. Thanks, everyone.